Hey guys, tonight we're diving into a topic that's chilly, awkward, and believe it or not, historically fascinating. We're talking about toilets. Not just any toilets though. Medieval castle toilets. In winter. That's right, you sitting up there in your fluffy socks and heated room are about to time travel back to an era where taking a bathroom break could literally risk frostbite and shame. And yeah, you probably won't survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'm not here to guilt you, I'm just the guy talking about medieval people freezing their butts off. Also, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I want to know if you're in a cozy cabin in Finland or on your lunch break in Atlanta. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself walking across the uneven stone floors of a castle built 600 years ago. It's winter, and not just any winter, a brutal one. The kind where your breath fogs instantly, your boots are stiff with frost, and every step echoes through chambers lined with cold, damp stone. There's a fire roaring in the Great Hall, sure, but that heat doesn't travel well through thick walls and narrow corridors, and unfortunately, nature is calling. There's no polite way to put it. You've got to go. But going to the bathroom in a medieval castle during winter isn't like tiptoeing down a hallway to a warm toilet seat. It's a trek, an ordeal, a strategic mission involving layers of wool, rough fabric, bad lighting, and the kind of architectural planning that makes you question the sanity of your ancestors. Your options? Limited, frankly. You could venture to a garderobe, yes, that's the technical term for a medieval castle toilet, but brace yourself. The term garderobe literally translates to guarding your robe. Why? Because in some theories, people believed the ammonia fumes from the waste might keep moths away from hanging clothes stored nearby, which means, yes, in some cases, people hung their clothes over the toilet chute. Medieval logic, everybody. So you push open a wooden door that leads to a narrow passage tucked into the outer wall of the castle. That's where the garderobe usually lives, built into the thickness of the stone, usually on a tower or an outer wall. Why? Because whatever comes out of you drops straight down, hopefully into a pit, a river, or more often than not, just onto the ground below. A lovely surprise for whoever happens to be walking past. Or worse, besieging the castle. As you sit, assuming you're brave enough to put your skin on that ice-cold seat, you realise this isn't just uncomfortable, it's cruel. The stone is freezing, there's no insulation. The wind whistles through the chute below, slapping your backside with Arctic-level air like some sort of elemental punishment. Every second feels like a dare from the universe. How long can you last? You can almost hear the stone walls whispering with centuries of groans from noble behinds subjected to the same fate. And if you think the lords and ladies had it easier, think again. Even royalty couldn't escape the chill. In fact, historians have noted that some castles had more private guardrobes for nobles, but those were often higher up in the towers, meaning the cold was even worse. Heat rises, yes, but medieval castles rarely had central heating. Fires couldn't be lit everywhere, too expensive, too smoky, and way too dangerous around straw beds and wooden beams. One documented trick. Some people would warm a stone or brick by the fire and carry it with them, like a DIY medieval seat warmer. Others resorted to just holding it in for as long as humanly possible. But given the diet back then, lots of rough bread, salted meat, and the occasional turnip, you didn't always have much of a choice. Of course, we have to talk about the servants, the poor souls tasked with cleaning the garderobes. Known later as gong farmers, these were the medieval equivalent of sanitation workers, only without gloves, machines, or dignity. In winter, their job got worse. Waste would freeze in the chutes. Sometimes it would stack up like a grotesque ice column blocking the shaft. And someone had to go in there and chip it out. Imagine explaining that job at a medieval career fair. There are records suggesting that in especially cold regions, people avoided garderobes entirely during the worst months. Instead, they used chamber pots, ceramic bowls kept under the bed or hidden in alcoves. More private, yes, but still had to be emptied. And who did that? Yep, the lowest ranking servant, often a young boy or girl, paid in bread and exposure to life's worst smells. Even the design of the garderobe didn't help in winter. Most had a simple wooden seat with a hole over a vertical shaft. No insulation, no cover, no way to stop snow from blowing up through the gap, and remember, breeches back then weren't quick release. You had to fumble with layers, possibly even untie things, all while your fingers were going numb. One quirky fact, some garderobes were built over castle entrances or walkways. not for comfort, but as an actual military feature. Invaders trying to breach the gate could be greeted by more than just arrows, if you get my drift. Now, scholars still debate whether medieval folks were as horrified by their bathroom experiences as we are. Some argue that cultural attitudes were more lax, bodily functions weren't as shameful, and enduring discomfort was part of life. Others believe the elite did everything they could to separate themselves from the filth, building more secluded garderobes and insisting on heavily perfumed surroundings. Whatever the case, one thing's clear. When you gotta go in a medieval castle, especially during winter, it's not a moment of relief. It's a calculated risk. You leave the toilet with red ears, frozen turned cheeks, both kinds, and a profound appreciation for modern plumbing. And guess what? That was just your first bathroom trip of the day. You've barely survived your icy encounter with the medieval castle toilet, and already you're wondering, who in their right mind invented such a thing? Enter the garderobe, the gloriously inadequate answer to every bathroom need of the Middle Ages. It sounds fancy, right? Like something you'd hang velvet cloaks in, maybe next to your gold-trimmed doublet. But no. In the architectural jargon of a stone fortress, a garderobe was the only thing standing between your bowels and the castle wall. The name itself has a weird charm to it. Garderobe is French in origin, meaning guard the robe. And yes, you're right to raise an eyebrow. One theory goes that people hung their clothes near, or even over the toilet chute because the ammonia-heavy air, produced by centuries of collective excretion, would repel moths. Let that sink in for a moment. Picture yourself storing your best winter cloak inches above a vertical poop shaft because, hey, at least the bugs stay away. This is not a society that shied away from multitasking. Now structurally, garderobes were clever-ish. They were usually built into the curtain walls of the castle, the thick outer layers that formed the fortress's defensive skin. Tucked into these walls were little stone chambers, often just big enough to crouch in. The seat would be a flat plank of wood with a hole in the middle, resting above a vertical shaft that dropped your business down to the outside world. No plumbing, no flushing, no dignity. But it worked, mostly. You find one on the northern wall of the keep, where the wind is sharpest. That should have been your first clue that something awful was awaiting your behind. As you step inside, the door creaks open like it's warning you. The interior is dim, always damp, and echoes with unsettling drips. It smells faintly like ammonia. Sure, but also like centuries of surrender. The wood seat is warped from age and moisture, and there's a thin layer of frost where, ideally, there should be warmth. There are no privacy features, no latches, no soundproofing. If someone walks past in the corridor, they can probably hear everything. And in some cases, the garderobes were communal, lined up side by side in a row, no partitions. Just a medieval version of toilet bonding time. And let's just say that the social vibe was different. One documented castle had a garderobe with 4 seats in a square. That's right, you could make eye contact while doing your business. Try imagining that the next time you're awkwardly avoiding eye contact with someone at a public urinal. Now, you might think the shaft beneath you just opens into the ground below, and sometimes it did. But depending on the status of the castle and the era, the chute might lead to a cesspit, a moat, or even just the outer wall. Whatever was below wasn't your problem, until, of course, it backed up, or froze, and oh, did it freeze. Winter changed the entire relationship with the garderobe. In warm months, sure, it was gross, but in winter, it became an arena of physical suffering. The draft coming up from the chute wasn't a breeze, it was a bitter, wet gale that sliced into you with surgical precision. You'd sit down and within seconds your thighs would go numb. Not just cold, numb. You didn't sit and think, you sat, acted, and left as fast as humanly possible. There are scattered stories of people trying to make the experience more tolerable. Some castle residents had fur-lined robes they'd wear only to the garderobe. Others would bring hot coals in a metal dish, just enough to warm the air a bit before settling in. Of course, there's a problem with introducing flames to a room full of flammable waste gases, but medieval people weren't always big on health and safety. And let's talk design quirks. Some garderobes jutted out from the castle wall entirely, like a stone box hanging in the air. These were called garderobe turrets, and they had a particular benefit. They let waste fall directly down the outer wall. Simple, efficient. Horrifying if you're walking below. One fringe theory even suggests that some castle architects angled the chute slightly outward, so that waste wouldn't just drop, it would arc. Yes, like medieval ballistic poop physics. The theory is debated, but you can't help but imagine a poor merchant getting beaned with last night's royal dinner while trying to deliver cabbages. Now here's something that continues to puzzle historians. Some garderobes were astonishingly ornate. In a few castles, like those belonging to the French aristocracy, garderobes had carved stone seats, decorative lintels, even tiny stained glass windows. You could almost forget you were sitting above 100 years' worth of organic regret. Almost. The reasons for this aesthetic effort remain debated. Was it to honour the dignity of the noble bowels? Was it about status? Or was it just that the artisans got bored of carving saints and thought, you know what would look great? A quatrefoil motif above the Duke's toilet. But no matter how pretty the surroundings, the reality was always the same. The cold bit deep, the stone never warmed, the smell clung to your clothes, and you left the garderobe with your body slightly defeated. But you also left with one very real historical truth embedded in your spine. These people were tough, and by these people I mean everyone. Nobles, servants, guards, cooks. They all used the garderobe. There were no golden thrones, no heated seats. Just holes in the wall, hope in your heart, and the understanding that every winter your butt would do battle with the forces of nature. So next time you're sitting on your modern toilet, warm tile underfoot, possibly scrolling TikTok, maybe give a little nod to the medieval souls who went before you. Literally, right before you, possibly still haunting the chute. So there you are, sitting on a stone slab with a hole in it, cheeks clenched against the cold, praying for this to be over quickly. And just as you think it can't get worse, surprise, it does. Because now we need to talk about what actually happens after you've done your royal duty. And no, there is no neat little handle to flush. Instead, everything you've just deposited falls over the side of the castle. Yes, really. It's hard to overstate just how medieval this whole system is. In many castles, the garderobe shaft simply opened out into open air, meaning that your bodily offering plummeted directly down the outer wall, sometimes into a cesspit dug below, or more commonly, just onto the ground. And let's be honest, not all of it made the ground. Some of it splattered, some of it froze mid-fall, and some of it probably ended up somewhere that made life significantly worse for someone standing underneath. That someone might have been a stable boy, a guard, a livestock animal, or maybe even an unlucky enemy trying to sneak in. Because yes, this wasn't just bad design, it was also somehow part of the castle's defence system. Picture it. You're an invader, scaling a wall at dawn, clutching your sword between your teeth, boots slipping on the icy stone. You finally get to the top of a ledge and boom, something warm and suspicious hits you in the face. Congratulations, you've just met the defensive side of medieval sanitation. Some castles even had garderobe projection placed directly above gates or blind spots, not for privacy but as a deterrent. Nothing says, maybe we rethink this siege, like getting hit with frozen human waste from 20 feet up. But let's bring it back to the ground, quite literally, because what fell from the castle didn't just vanish, it piled up. During the warmer months it decomposed badly. During winter, it froze into grotesque, jagged mounds. Historians have found archaeological evidence of frozen waste drifts, formed over months of continuous deposit. That's right. Your daily offering might become part of a slowly growing ice sculpture no one wanted. If the castle had a moat, things got even weirder. Many garderobes were built to empty directly into the moat. Yes, the same water that protected the castle. A watery barrier filled with poop, and in winter, as the moat froze over, the waste stayed visible under the ice like medieval abstract art. Or worse, it froze on the surface, creating a glossy brown glaze on your scenic defence system. Makes you think twice about that romantic moat imagery in fairy tales, huh? Even castles that boasted cesspits had problems. In theory, cesspits were built to contain the waste, usually in a stone-lined hole under the castle or in a courtyard. In practice, these pits often overflowed, especially when frozen. Waste would back up the shaft, blocking the chute entirely. You know that saying, when it hits the fan? Well, in medieval castles it hit the floor, or the seat, or occasionally the walls. There are recorded instances of cesspits exploding. Let that image rest with you. After weeks of frozen build-up, a sudden thaw could release pressure, sending an avalanche of waste back up through the shaft like something out of a horror story. Now imagine you're the poor servant tasked with investigating that blockage. This leads us to the human cost, because somebody had to deal with all of this. Yes, your visit to the garderobe may be finished, but for someone else the work was just beginning. And on freezing mornings, That work meant scraping waste from the castle walls, shoveling frozen excrement off the ground, and unclogging chutes so that the rest of the castle's noble backsides could continue their daily routines. You can imagine these workers, faces wrapped in cloth, hands numb, grumbling medieval curses under their breath as they tried to chip away at a job that should never ever involve a pickaxe. And yet, there's a kind of weird brilliance to the system. Castles were defensive strongholds first and livable spaces second. The guardrobe chute served multiple purposes. It removed waste from living quarters, funneled it outside the walls, and yes, even created hazards for would-be attackers. Did it smell bad? Absolutely. Was it hygienic? Not even close. But did it function? You bet. There's even a fringe theory among castle scholars that the placement of guardrobes was strategic. Some believe architects intentionally directed chutes toward the castle's most vulnerable walls, hoping that piles of waste would deter climbing. Others think that regularly used guardrobes were built in specific towers to keep servants busy and nobles relatively clean. Is this true? Honestly, no one knows for sure. The records are scarce, but the theory lives on, mostly because it's just so perfectly medieval. And then there's the social side of all this. People knew which garderobes were used most. They knew which parts of the courtyard to avoid in winter because that's where the Lord's chute lands. In fact, some castle walls were visibly stained from years of use, dark vertical streaks marking the trail of gravity and poor sanitation. Imagine giving a guest a castle tour and casually pointing out the noble stream. That's history for you. The kicker? Despite all this, the guardrobe was considered a sign of luxury. Most peasants didn't have toilets at all, just a bucket, a field, or a hole in the ground. To have a private stone chamber that emptied itself was the height of comfort. Even if it meant your waste froze into an actual weapon, and the smell could knock out a cow, you were still living the dream. From a medieval perspective, anyway. So the next time someone complains about a public restroom, maybe remind them that their modern inconvenience doesn't involve gravity-fed poop raining onto passers-by frozen walls of filth, or an unlucky stable boy catching the fallout of a duchess's dinner. Because once upon a time, in a freezing castle on a hill, that was just Tuesday. You've now witnessed the cold, unforgiving design of the garderobe and the long drop that followed your business. But let's zoom in, literally, on what happened beneath the royal butt. That mysterious dark shaft wasn't just a hole, it was a whole system. Crude but carefully thought out, built with the same strategy that kept invading armies out and food supplies in. Because medieval people weren't clueless about waste, they just had fewer options and way too much stone. First off, the shaft beneath the seat, known as a waste chute, was typically a vertical tunnel built into the castle wall itself. Depending on the castle's layout, this chute could be just a few feet deep or several stories tall. In a multi-level keep, the higher the chamber, the longer the drop. And yes, waste velocity was absolutely a thing. There are theories that in tall towers, the waste reached a speed that could splatter hard enough to damage the collection pit. You're thinking, that sounds fake. But consider the weight of winter diets, the roughness of medieval plumbing and gravity doing its thing. Suddenly, poop physics becomes a real science. Now, ideally, the chute led to a cesspit, a semi-contained area dug out of the earth and lined with stone or timber. These pits were occasionally cleaned, though cleaned is generous. More often they were left to compost on their own, developing layers like a tragic lasagna. In winter though, the cesspit froze, solid, turned into a permafrost of filth. Not only did this slow down decomposition, it created a backup that could creep higher and higher up the chute, turning what should be a drop-and-forget situation into a bubbling pressure cooker. Some garderobes even had little drain holes in their walls to release gas buildup, medieval fart vents, basically. Because yes, methane is real, and no, you don't want to trap it in a stone box. If there wasn't a cesspit, the chute usually emptied into the castle moat or a runoff channel. These channels might lead to a river, or more realistically, just the lowest point on the castle grounds, where the smell could linger and the cold couldn't do enough to make a difference. Castles like Rochester and Caernarfon in the UK had guardrobes that literally dumped into their defensive ditches. It was a natural blend of security and sewage. Why build a separate waste system when you can just poop into your fortress's outer moat? Makes sense, if you never want to drink that water or walk near it again. There's also evidence that some castles used angled shafts, built to encourage a better flow and avoid build-up. These weren't complex, just a slight tilt to the stone tunnel, but they show that people were experimenting with gravity and waste management long before anyone thought of flushing. In fact, a few castle engineers designed double chutes, one leading to a disposal area, and another that diverted rainwater to rinse the shaft occasionally. That's right, medieval poop washing tech. It wasn't common, and it didn't always work, but when it did, it was the gold standard of castle luxury. Now, before you assume every chute was perfectly designed, let's acknowledge the many failures. Some garderobes were poorly sealed. Cold air would shoot up like a mini blizzard, carrying with it the aroma of several decades of mistakes. Others weren't built tall enough, meaning waste just piled up right below the seat. During harsh winters, the pile would freeze into a throne of misery. If the shaft was cracked or had leaks, that meant the walls absorbed some of the moisture, and medieval stone is terrible at staying clean. Mould, bacteria and worse seeped into the living spaces. In especially poor designs, the garderobe was so close to kitchens or bedrooms that the smell couldn't be ignored. Imagine trying to sleep while the corner of your room is gently radiating the scent of fermented humanity. Even castles with great designs had to worry about blockages. A rat falls in, a stone slips from the wall, or worse, a prank gone wrong. Yes, there are fringe stories of people deliberately plugging up the chute as an act of rebellion. Oh no, my lord's toilet won't flush, that's a real shame. And then, of course, there were the unfortunate souls who fell in. It's rare but not unheard of. In 1183, King Henry of Germany reportedly died after falling into a cesspit. Some claim it was an accident. Others whisper of an assassination gone right. Either way, he drowned in waste. In winter, it might have been slightly less fatal, but definitely more humiliating. Maintenance fell to a group of workers usually known as gong farmers. These were the folks who entered the chutes, sometimes from below, sometimes from above, and manually removed the waste. In the winter, their jobs became even harder. The waste was frozen solid, so they had to break it apart using metal tools. No gloves, no mask, just grit, cloth wraps, and a willingness to do the worst job in the world. They worked by torchlight in tiny, suffocating spaces, and here's the kicker. They weren't allowed to work during daylight hours in some towns because their smell was considered too offensive. So if you ever think your job stinks, well. But the shaft beneath the seat also had its place in castle folklore. Some believed evil spirits entered the body during vulnerable moments, like when using the toilet. The shaft was a direct tunnel to the underworld in their eyes, a literal hellmouth. That's why you'll occasionally find old texts recommending a quick prayer before squatting, just in case the devil decided to grab your butt. It's also why certain noble families built garderobes with tiny crosses above the seat, holy protection from spiritual ambushes while your pants were down. Even among scholars, there's debate about how seriously the shaft system was engineered. Some argue that it was just whatever worked at the time, dig a hole, build a box, let gravity do its thing. Others believe it reflected a deeper understanding of airflow, waste decomposition, and even temperature control. There are castles with garderobes positioned so precisely that the prevailing winter winds helped ventilate the chute, basically the medieval version of an exhaust fan. Accidental? Maybe. Genius? Absolutely. In the end, the shaft below the seat was both a marvel and a menace. It worked, but just barely. It carried away your shame, your regret, and sometimes your dignity. But in the frozen dark of a stone castle, it was the only thing standing between you and something far worse, having to use a bucket. So next time you sit comfortably on your heated porcelain throne, just remember, once upon a time, your entire bathroom experience depended on a hole in the wall, a decent angle, and gravity. And if you were lucky, the pile below was still frozen. By now you're well acquainted with the frigid seat, the terrifying drop, and the architectural gamble of medieval waste disposal. But there's a layer of the experience that sticks, literally, and that's the smell. It's the part of castle life no one talks about in fairy tales. You can dress a knight in shining armour and light all the torches you want, but the truth is, once you step inside a stone castle, especially in the dead of winter, you're going to notice it right away. The air is thick, damp, and tinged with a stench that has nowhere to go. You see, unlike the open windows of modern homes, or even the cross-ventilation of a humble wooden cottage, castles were built for defence, not airflow. Thick stone walls, great for keeping out arrows, terrible for letting out gases. And in winter, when every opening was shuttered to keep what little heat existed from escaping, the interior air became trapped. The fires from the hearths added smoke, the unwashed bodies of dozens, sometimes hundreds, of people contributed their own rich bouquet, and then there were the garderobes. Not sealed, not soundproofed, just open shafts funneling centuries of waste down the wall, and in some cases, right back up in the form of odour. You were hoping the cold helped. It did. Barely. Yes. Freezing temperatures slowed down decomposition, but not completely. The scent of ancient waste still lingered, clinging to clothes, straw mats, and the rough wool blankets piled in noble chambers. People tried to fight it, of course. They hung herbs, lavender, rosemary, thyme, near the garderobe entrance. They burned sweet-smelling resins like frankincense or myrrh when they could afford it. Wealthier lords even commissioned ornate pomanders, little balls of scented wax and spices that were worn like jewellery. Not because they liked the smell, but because they were actively shielding themselves from everything else. Some of these odours weren't just gross, they were believed to be dangerous. The medieval theory of miasma, the idea that disease spread through bad air, was taken seriously. Foul smells were thought to carry illness into the body. So if your garderobe stank more than usual, it wasn't just unpleasant, it was a health crisis. In winter, when everything was closed up and people gathered indoors for warmth, the fear intensified. An unusually pungent garderobe might be seen as a breeding ground for plague, or a sign that evil spirits were gathering. And yes, that brings us to the strange, almost spiritual relationship people had with smell. Some believed that the odour of waste attracted demons or fairies, especially in winter when other distractions were scarce. There are folk tales, real ones, that warn of mischievous spirits lurking near garderobes waiting for an unsuspecting noble to drop their trousers and in doing so let something else into the world. That's why a few castles had crosses or carved religious icons near their toilets. Not for decoration, for divine odour control, but beyond superstition, there was also simple practicality. The smell made the garderobe a space of pure avoidance. No one lingered, no one read a book there. You went, you gagged, and you got out. Castle servants would use straw or rushes to try to absorb some of the moisture on the stone floors around the garderobe, but after a few weeks of freezing nights and tracked in slush, it all turned to a damp, semi-organic mush that made things worse. Some garderobes had trenches carved into the floor to allow for drainage, but again in the winter, those froze. And frozen trenches don't drain. They hold, and they smell. Imagine a bowl of week-old stew you left outside, only it's under your bathroom floor. Now some of the more optimistic castle builders tried to engineer better solutions. Vent shafts were built into walls leading out from garderobes, hoping to suck out the stench. They worked in the summer, sort of. In winter, though, those same vents became icy wind tunnels. Anyone seated over a garderobe near a ventilation shaft might find themselves being lightly frostbitten by a draught that smelled like rotting cabbage. It was a lose-lose. Do you freeze to death or choke on the fumes? And if you're thinking, at least it was just the toilet that stank, oh how sweet your innocence is, the smell wasn't confined to that one miserable room. The shaft itself often ran through or alongside living chambers, so if your bedchamber was near the waste chute, you'd get ambient odour day and night, especially in winter, when chimney flues, closed windows and poor insulation trapped every whiff like a terrible medieval Glade plug-in. There are accounts, vague but reliable, of noble guests refusing to stay in certain rooms because of the proximity to the garderobe chute. And yet these were the best castles had to offer. Remember, most peasants lived in thatched huts with pigs inside. At least in a castle, the toilet was in a room, even if that room smelled like old soup and despair. A particularly fascinating fringe theory suggests that the placement of garderobes in some castles wasn't just about defence or proximity to bedrooms. It may have also been based on wind direction. That's right. Some historians believe that architects studied the prevailing winds in order to place garderobes on the leeward side of the building so that the odour wouldn't waft back into the living quarters. Now, was this always followed? Clearly not, but the fact that it was considered at all tells you how bad the problem was. If a breeze shifted direction midwinter, it could turn a hallway into a corridor of nausea. So what did people do to cope? Some covered their noses with cloth soaked in vinegar or rosewater. Others avoided the garderobe altogether and used chamber pots, which, let's be honest, probably made the smell worse once those were left full overnight. A chamber pot under your bed in a sealed stone room in January? That's not a life hack. That's a war crime. In the end, the smell of the medieval garderobe was more than just a nuisance. It was a constant presence, a reminder of the limits of architecture, the shortcomings of status, and the reality that no matter how high your castle tower, your excrement still had the last word. And in winter, that word was shouted back up the chute with a frozen, fragrant vengeance. So next time you light a candle in your bathroom, take a deep breath, appreciate the air, appreciate the ventilation, and remember that in a freezing stone castle with no flush, no seal and no mercy, the smell never really left. It just waited. You've now felt the seat, smelled the smell, and stared into the dark void beneath the stone slab. But tonight, it's time to talk about the real villain in this story. The part that froze first, hurt the most, and ruined lives one frosty cheek at a time, the toilet seat itself. Because while medieval architecture had its rough edges, none were quite as cruel as the moment bare skin met an icy, unpadded slab of carved stone in the dead of winter. Let's just cut to the chase. Medieval toilet seats were never comfortable. They weren't meant to be. In most garderobes, the seat was nothing more than a thick plank of wood or a smooth slab of stone placed over the chute. It might be roughly shaped to fit a human form, but ergonomic was not a word in their vocabulary, and in winter that slab turned into a frozen throne from the ninth circle of hell. Imagine waking up before dawn in a room barely warmer than the outside air. You shuffle your way down the corridor, half asleep, layered in scratchy wool. You push open the garderobe door, and it's already freezing in there, the air biting at your face. You approach the seat knowing what's coming, but you have no choice. And then it happens. Skin meets stone. For a second you convince yourself you'll be fine, but the cold hits with the intensity of betrayal. It's not just uncomfortable, it's shocking. You involuntarily gasp, maybe shout, and now you're fully awake in the worst possible way. And here's the thing, you can't exactly hover. Not in layers of stiff winter clothing. Not when balance is compromised by slippery soles and the added risk of falling into the shaft. Nope, you've got to commit. Which means lowering your full weight onto a surface that's probably just a few degrees above freezing. You're not just doing your business, you're enduring a ritual of physical and emotional trauma that'll stay with you longer than whatever you ate for dinner. People tried to cope, of course. One of the most common hacks was to bring a warmed stone or brick from the hearth and rest it on the seat for a few minutes. This didn't make it warm, just slightly less like a kiss from a frozen grave. Others used folded cloths, furs, or even padded cushions, though those tended to soak up, let's say, unwanted moisture from the general environment. Still, a noble lady might keep a privy pillow tucked in her chamber, warmed by the fire and carried discreetly by a maid when the time came. These little acts of rebellion against the cold were often the only protection between human dignity and a literal butt freeze. And yes, we're talking actual frostbite here. While rare, it wasn't impossible. In the most bitter winters, with prolonged exposure and insufficient padding, there was a real risk of minor tissue damage. You probably wouldn't lose anything essential, but numbness, chafing and soreness were common, especially for children and the elderly, who had less body mass to insulate themselves and often less control over, let's say, timing. If you took too long or, heaven forbid, fell asleep mid-squat, you could suffer for days afterward. Which brings us to winter nights. Using the garderobe after dark was its own adventure. Without electric lights or reliable lanterns, you navigated the icy castle halls by the flicker of a torch or maybe a tiny candle stub, and once inside the garderobe, there was rarely any light at all. That meant squatting in total darkness, on a frozen surface, hoping nothing important got stuck to anything else. And don't forget the rodents. Yes, mice and rats liked the warmth of cesspits, and occasionally climbed back up the shaft looking for food or just to say hi. You've never known true fear until you've heard scratching below you while you're seated, vulnerable, and entirely unprepared for a surprise visitor. Now here's something fun. Not all garderobe seats were created equal. In some castles, particularly those belonging to wealthier nobles, seats were carved from oak or lined with leather padding. These were often reserved for the lord or the lady of the house, while everyone else got the cold, hard communal version. Some garderobes even had double seats, one for adults and a smaller one for children, which was thoughtful in theory but probably didn't make the temperature any kinder. One castle in France reportedly had a garderobe built with a small fireplace in the wall next to the seat, possibly to offer warmth during use. Was it safe? Probably not. Was it genius? Absolutely. Unfortunately, it doesn't appear to have caught on widely, because if it had, we wouldn't be here discussing frostbitten rear ends as a normal part of castle life. The psychological impact of this daily ordeal can't be overlooked either. Imagine dreading every bathroom trip, not just because of the smell or the distance, but because of the physical pain. That sharp, though jarring cold at 5 a.m, it shaped your day. It made you eat less just to delay the next visit. It made you think twice about that second mug of ale. certainly made you question the joys of being born into the aristocracy if this was what passed for a luxury. Even in modern reconstructions of medieval castles, tourists are often surprised at how small and narrow the guardrobes are. And yet, despite their cramped size, the seat itself is massive, cold, and completely unapologetic. There's no hiding the purpose of this room. No distraction, just stone, wind, and shame. Interestingly, some castles had multiple guardrobes side by side, allowing for, shall we say, social toileting. And while that's a horror all its own, it did mean that in winter, people weren't suffering alone. Misery loves company, especially when that company can empathise with your frost-numbed thighs and the existential dread of sitting down. Now, scholars are still debating whether people in the Middle Ages actually hated using these cold seats as much as we assume. Some argue that people were simply tougher, more used to physical discomfort, more resigned to the daily trials of castle life. Others believe that even back then there was grumbling, swearing, and a whole lot of internal screaming happening every time someone lowered themselves onto that slab. Personally, based on every diary, poem, and complaint that's survived the centuries, I'm going with the screaming. So to sum it all up, if you lived in a medieval castle during the winter, every toilet trip was a high-stakes gamble between urgent need and emotional trauma. You never got used to it, you just survived it. One icy squat at a time. You've braved the frozen slab, you've breathed the cursed air. And maybe, just maybe, you've started to think, oh, well, at least it's over when it's over. But hold that hopeful thought, because now we're stepping into the surreal horror show of what happens when the contents of those medieval toilets don't just sit there. They freeze solid. Welcome to the icy underworld of frozen waste, where physics meets tragedy, and the term crappy situation becomes alarmingly literal. Let's start with the basics. Waste doesn't vanish, even in castles. And in the winter, when temperatures dropped below freezing, often for weeks at a time, the excrement in chutes, cesspits, and even chamber pots didn't decompose. It froze. Completely. We're talking about a situation where your nightly deposit could turn into a brick by morning. Or worse, join the growing ice sculpture forming inside the shaft, like a particularly cursed geological formation. In a well-designed garderobe with a direct chute to the outside, this might not have been a huge problem. Waste dropped, froze somewhere along the wall, and stayed there until spring. Gross, of course, but manageable. The trouble started when those chutes were partially enclosed or poorly ventilated. Waste would begin to build up from the bottom, layer upon layer, each one freezing solid and effectively creating a medieval poop stalagmite. Over time, this icy pillar grew upward, and if the temperature held, it could reach the seat level. Suddenly, your daily routine involves sitting directly above a tower of waste frozen into place like the world's worst popsicle. And that's not even the worst part. Because when the shaft clogged, the system broke. Everything you added sat precariously on top of the frozen heap, just waiting for something, anything to cause a catastrophic thaw. A warmer day? A flood from melting snow? A servant too lazy to check the blockage? Boom! Avalanche. All that tightly packed, frozen waste became a sludged tsunami heading back up the chute with no warning. There are stories, gruesome, probably exaggerated but terrifying, nonetheless, of garderobes exploding during a spring thaw, splattering rooms, ruining floors, and permanently ruining any optimism one might have about medieval life. And if you think chamber pots were better in winter, think again. These were ceramic or metal containers kept under beds or in corners, and in cold weather, their contents froze too. Which sounds fine until you remember that ceramic becomes brittle in freezing temperatures. That means your full chamber pot could crack overnight, leaving sharp shards and a frozen mess under your bed. The smell returned as soon as the sun rose, of course, because while the ice suppressed the odour, it didn't neutralise it. It just delayed the horror. So what did people do when things froze solid? Well, if you were a servant, you reached for the chisel. That's right. Metal tools were used to break up frozen waste inside cesspits and shafts. Sometimes they used long poles with hooks on the end, sometimes it was just brute force with a shovel. Either way, the job wasn't quick. And you weren't just hacking away at generic material, you were fighting through a sculpture of months' worth of digestive consequences, all compressed into frozen layers like an archaeological dig from hell. To make it worse, there was a real risk of injury. Swinging a metal tool in a confined, slippery shaft wasn't exactly OSHA approved. If you chipped too hard, you could crack the chute walls, sending icy filth down onto whoever was working below. If the waste broke loose suddenly, you risked being buried in it. And yes, this happened. Servants were occasionally injured or even killed doing midwinter garderobe maintenance. Imagine trying to explain that cause of death on a gravestone. Perished beneath the frozen dung of the High Lord of Wessex. Then there's the engineering question. Why didn't they design these systems to avoid freezing in the first place? The answer's simple, because they had no way to. Medieval castles didn't have insulation in the modern sense. There was no piping, no heated shafts, and no way to pump warm air through stone walls. Fires couldn't be lit in garderobes, they were full of flammable gases. So once temperatures dropped, every part of the system froze. It was inevitable. The only variable was how long you could survive before it all went wrong. One quirky workaround, though rare, was the use of ashes or lime sprinkled into the pit. The idea was that the chemical reaction could generate a bit of heat, or at least slow the freezing process, but this was mostly wishful thinking. At best, it helped the top layer stay soft enough to remove. At worst, it did nothing but add a fine grey powder to an already unholy mixture. Of course, there's an ongoing debate among historians about how widespread these frozen disasters were. Some argue that in milder climates, say southern France or parts of Italy, frozen garderobes weren't as big a concern. But in northern Europe, Scandinavia or the Scottish Highlands? Absolutely. Archaeological digs at certain castles have revealed thick deposits of compacted waste layers, frozen in time. Sometimes literally frozen thanks to permafrost conditions. It's like Pompeii, but instead of ash, it's something much smellier, and you can imagine what that meant for castle morale. A clogged garderobe in winter wasn't just a private inconvenience, it could become a castle-wide crisis. If the main chute backed up, people had to use chamber pots. If chamber pots froze and cracked, they had to go outside. And going outside in waist-deep snow, in robes and leather boots, meant risking frostbite, wolves, or just the shame of being spotted squatting behind the wall. Servants sometimes rigged up emergency latrines in unused rooms, wooden buckets with straw at the bottom hidden behind tapestries or tucked into alcoves. And when those filled, well, that's another problem for someone else's shift. There's even evidence that during particularly harsh winters, castles would designate a night soil chamber, a temporary indoor waste room used just until things thawed. These spaces were usually cleared out after winter, with great ceremony and enormous regret. You can only imagine the joy of being assigned that spring cleaning task. So the next time your pipes freeze and you curse the modern world, think of this. At least your frozen waste doesn't rise like an undead golem, blocking your only exit and threatening to break loose at any moment. At least you don't need a pickaxe just to use the bathroom. And at least when it all thaws, your house doesn't suddenly become a splash zone for liquefied regrets. Because in medieval castles, when things froze, they didn't just stop, they waited. And when the thaw came, it brought vengeance. So far, we've spent a lot of time with the stone throne itself, its terrible design, its frozen cruelty, and the architectural drama of getting waste to fall in the right place without turning into a public hazard. But what if you didn't want to make the trek to the garderobe at all? What if it was midnight, snowing seways outside, and the thought of walking half a castle just to freeze your soul out didn't sound appealing? Enter the unsung hero of medieval defecation, the chamber pot. Now, if you're picturing a quaint ceramic bowl with little painted flowers on the side, you're not wrong, but you're also not ready. Chamber pots weren't about charm, they were about survival. In winter, especially in the upper floors of castles or during the middle of the night, no one wanted to make the cold walk to the garderobe, especially not barefoot on icy stone floors with only a candle to guide them. So every noble bedroom had a chamber pot tucked beneath the bed, behind a curtain, or in a specially carved wooden stool with a hole in the top, kind of like a cosy medieval porta-potty. When nature called in the dead of night, you'd throw back your furs, step onto the freezing floor, crouch or sit over the pot, and try to do your business as quickly and quietly as possible. These pots were usually made of ceramic, metal, or sometimes even wood lined with pewter. They varied in size and quality, depending on your rank, because of course even your nighttime emergencies were judged by class. But winter added a whole new layer of fun. First, the pot itself was cold as death. Metal ones were the worst. They practically burned your skin with frost. Ceramic cracked easily in freezing temperatures if not handled carefully. And then there was the obvious problem, what to do with the contents. You couldn't exactly empty it into the garderobe at 2 a.m, and you certainly weren't taking it outside in your nightshirt, so many people just left it. until morning, which meant a full night's sleep spent in the same room with a steaming bowl of human regret gently cooling beside you. Romantic. Of course, chamber pots didn't stay private for long. By morning, the task of emptying them fell to servants, young, overworked, underpaid, and perpetually disgusted. It was their job to take the full pots to the garderobe, the courtyard, or the outer wall and dump them. And in winter, when everything froze, this process became exponentially worse. The contents were often solid by dawn, which meant the pot had to be banged, scraped, or even soaked in warm water before it could be emptied. Try doing that with numb fingers and a line of angry nobles waiting for their pots to be cleaned. And heaven help you if you spilled it. One wrong step on an icy corridor, and suddenly you've created a medieval slip hazard that not only breaks bones but breaks spirits. There are actual written complaints from castle stewards about unsanitary spillage in hallways, especially during winter. Some castles attempted to avoid this by placing buckets or troughs at the end of corridors, so servants had a halfway station before reaching the outer dump sites. Those buckets, they froze too. They also smelled like doom. If you were particularly wealthy, or lucky, you had a close stool. This was an early form of indoor toilet furniture, a wooden chair or bench with a hidden chamber pot built into it. These were often padded, sometimes even upholstered in velvet or embroidered cloth, which honestly raises more questions than it answers. Royal versions were almost luxurious. King Henry VIII had a stool servant, a real titled courtier, whose entire job was to manage the king's toileting, and in winter that job included pre-warming the seat. Imagine trying to write that on a resume. But most people didn't have that. Most people had to make do with the basics. Some servants even used slop buckets, which weren't emptied every day during harsh weather. These would sit in the corner of a storage room quietly fermenting until someone could carry them out without slipping on snow-covered stairs or getting pelted by hail. The worst part? If there was a siege or the roads froze shut, those buckets stayed where they were, for weeks. Now, one fringe fact that doesn't get nearly enough attention. Some households added straw or ash to the pot to absorb liquid and mask the smell. This makeshift toilet mix helped a little, but in freezing weather, the result was still a half-solid, half-muddy nightmare that had to be scooped out. There's evidence of people using heated stones or bits of burning coal dropped into the pot to melt frozen contents, an act of desperation that sometimes ended with shattered pottery or scorched undergarments. Because of course, in a world without reliable central heat, you're playing with fire near poop. So how did people feel about all this? Well, they didn't talk about it much in public. Toilet habits were considered unmentionable, even when they affected everyone. But you can read between the lines. In letters, in journals, in the architectural evolution of castles, you can see the small ways they tried to avoid the chamber pot life. Adding extra garderobes, building small privy towers, encouraging morning routines that involved waiting until it was just warm enough to go outside. Even the nobility, cloaked in silk and powdered perfume, had to make peace with the reality that they shared their bedchamber with a chilly little pot of consequences. And for the record, kids weren't spared from this. Children had their own chamber pots, sometimes ornately decorated, sometimes just carved wood, but guess who cleaned those? Still the servants. Always the servants. And in winter, when everyone was cooped up indoors, you can imagine how quickly things piled up, sometimes literally. The whole chamber pot system was basically a slow-moving crisis in winter. It worked, sort of, but only with constant effort and zero margin for error. And if you think this was just a poor person problem, think again. Even the highest lords and ladies had to squat over a cold pot from time to time, just hopefully with a better view and someone else doing the cleanup. So, next time you grumble about a long walk to the bathroom or sigh because your toilet seat is cold, remember this, it could be worse. You could be squatting over a frozen metal bowl by candlelight on a stone floor in a castle hallway, hoping the servant doesn't trip while carrying what used to be your dinner, and if you're lucky, it won't be frozen solid at this time. Let's take a moment to give a standing ovation, metaphorically, of course, to the people who really made medieval sanitation function, the ones who cleaned up after everyone else. Because behind every freezing garderobe, every brimming chamber pot, every slippery slop bucket abandoned in the hallway, there was a person, usually unpaid, definitely underappreciated, and most likely gagging, who had to clean it all up. And no, they didn't have gloves, or disinfectant, or will to live. Meet the Gong Farmers, that's not a nickname. That was the actual title. Derived from the word gong, which referred to human waste, these were the people who maintained cesspits and garderobes, and they had the worst job in the entire medieval world. Worse than a rat catcher. Worse than a grave robber. These people literally climbed into pits of poop in winter with a bucket and a shovel, and removed the evidence of noble digestion one icy scoop at a time. Now, farmer is doing a lot of heavy lifting here. Gong farmers weren't cultivating anything. Their job was extraction, plain and filthy. In castles, where waste accumulated in shafts or pits beneath the guardrobes, someone had to regularly remove the build-up, especially in winter when decomposition slowed and everything just sat there, freezing into thick, unmovable slab. Imagine walking into a narrow stone closet with nothing but a torch and a spade. The air is thick and sour, the stone's slick with condensation, and the cell, well, let's just say you don't breathe through your nose anymore. Now add in the fact that it's freezing. The contents of the pit have hardened like ancient pottery, but it still gives off enough odour to make your stomach turn inside out, and you've got to climb down, chip away at it, and hoist it up bucket by bucket. There were no hazard suits, just layers of rough cloth, a hood if you were lucky, and probably a scarf soaked in vinegar or herbs tied over your face. Not that it helped. Some workers chewed cloves or garlic to dull the smell from the inside. Others just accepted that they'd never smell right again, and in towns or cities, gong farmers often weren't even allowed to live among the general population. Their homes were on the outskirts, because it was widely accepted that they carried the stench of death, or at least digestion, with them wherever they went. And yet, in some cases, this was actually a paid profession. Gong farmers were hired by castles, monasteries, and even towns to maintain the sanitation systems. They were paid well by medieval standards, because nobody else wanted to do it. And in a weird way, they were respected for their necessity, if not their aroma. No gong farmers meant no usable toilets, and in winter, when everything froze and clogged and backed up, their job became even more important, and infinitely more miserable. One fringe detail that often gets overlooked: some gong farmers worked at night, not just because the smell was less noticeable, but because it was less embarrassing. Hauling buckets of human waste through a castle courtyard isn't exactly a flattering look, especially if you trip and create a medieval biohazard zone. Night shifts meant fewer witnesses, fewer insults, and a slightly reduced risk of being splashed with someone else's regret. But let's not pretend these workers were free from ridicule. Even though the job was essential, gong farmers were often socially ostracised. They were banned from certain religious services, denied full participation in guilds, and their children were often forced into the same line of work whether they wanted it or not. And if you were wondering, yes, they were also the ones who had to clean up when someone missed, or when a noble got drunk and threw up in the garderobe, or when chamber pots cracked and spilled across a sleeping area. Their job description wasn't just clean poop, it was clean everything people don't want to think about. And there's a darker side too, because this wasn't just a bad job, it was a dangerous one. Cesspits sometimes filled with methane gas. A single spark from a torch could ignite the fumes, turning a midnight cleanup into a literal firestorm. Some gong farmers died of asphyxiation, breathing in the trapped gases of decades of waste. Others drowned in pits during heavy rains or after a chute collapsed. There are even a few chilling records of gong farmers being buried alive when frozen waste walls suddenly gave way. You've heard of landslides. Now imagine one made of everything people thought was gone, and yet somehow the work got done, week after week, winter after winter, year after year, because it had to. If the garderobe froze solid, they chipped it out. If the chamber pots backed up, they emptied them. If the smell overwhelmed the halls, they shoveled straw into the corridors to absorb it. Their efforts were the invisible backbone of castle life. Silent, thankless, and frozen to the bone. In some parts of England, gong farmers were actually required by law to register their job. It was a formal position, recognised by the local lord or town council. They had set working hours, regulations for waste disposal, and in rare cases, even legal protection. If someone assaulted a gong farmer while they were working, say, as a joke or out of spite, they could face a hefty fine. Because even the law understood you don't mess with the guy who keeps your toilet from turning into a frozen volcano of pestilence. And for the record, the title changed depending on region. In Germany, you might be called a Nachtmann, literally nightman. In France, something a bit more elegant like vidangeur. But make no mistake, the job was the same. Climb down into the pit, haul out the filth and try not to think too hard about your life choices. So while we spend a lot of time laughing at medieval toilet design, it's worth pausing to remember the real people who suffered to keep those systems functional. The gong farmers didn't get the glory. They didn't get the fire-warmed seats or the scented pomanders. They got the worst shifts, the worst smells, and the worst reputations. But they also got something no one else in the castle had. The unspoken power of being absolutely essential. Because without them, everything froze, everything backed up, and the castle, so proud, so fortified, so noble, sank into its own filth, one bucket at a time. Alright, so we've established that medieval castles had terrible plumbing, colder-than-death toilet seats, and a sanitation crew that basically lived in the ninth circle of hell. But now it's time to answer the question that's been quietly hovering in your mind like an unpleasant odour. What did they wipe with? Because, spoiler alert, there was no Charmin Ultra Soft. No triple-ply quilted luxury, no heated bidets, just whatever they could get their hands on. And winter? Winter made it all so much worse. Let's start with the obvious. Toilet paper as we know it did not exist in medieval Europe. In fact, even the idea of having a designated wiping material was a bit of a luxury. For most people, the process of cleaning up after a visit to the garderobe involved using natural materials, things you could find lying around, things that didn't cost money, and ideally things that didn't freeze into weapons when the temperature dropped below zero. So what were the go-to materials? Moss was a fan favourite. Soft, spongy, absorbent, basically nature's version of a wet wipe if you could gather it fresh. It grew plentifully in damp areas and was easy to collect during the warmer months. Smart families would dry out bundles of moss in the summer and store it in sacks near the garderobe, but in winter it froze hard, which meant you were either rubbing your most delicate regions with a cold, stiff, leafy clump, or you were throwing it into the fire to thaw and risking burning your hand just to get a halfway decent wipe. Then there was straw, cheap, accessible, and, let's say, structurally challenging. Ever tried to clean anything with straw? It crumbles, it pokes, it doesn't absorb so much as redistribute. Still, it was used, often bundled into a sort of makeshift brush. In some castles, servants would pre-soak the straw in water or lye to soften it, which sounds thoughtful until you realise softened. Medieval straw is still just glorified kindling with dreams of being hay. Scraps of cloth were used by the wealthy, old linen, worn-out garments, bits of tattered wool. In noble households, a basket of cloth scraps might be left near the close stool or garderobe for just this purpose. These were sometimes referred to as clouts, and if you're wondering what happened to them after use, well, someone had to collect them, wash them, and reuse them. That's right, reusable toilet rags. Not every castle had the luxury of tossing things after a single wipe. Winter made washing them even more of a nightmare. Frozen water, frozen mop, frozen soap, if they had any, and frozen rags stiff with last week's disaster meant that cleaning them was as bad, if not worse, than using them in the first place. Oh. Now brace yourself, because it gets weirder. In some places, pieces of ceramic or broken pottery were used. Sharp, a little. Effective, debatable. Archaeologists have uncovered ancient shards in Roman and medieval latrines that were apparently used for this exact purpose. They'd smooth the edges, allegedly, but in cold weather, even the smoothest ceramic feels like scraping your skin with frozen glass. Some historians argue these shards were more symbolic, possibly used to scoop rather than wipe. Which is better? Questionable. Either way, it's not a comforting image. And then the wild cards. People used leaves, though good luck finding those in a snow-covered castle courtyard. They used animal fur if they were rich and a little extra. They used handfuls of snow, which at least doubled as a cleansing and numbing agent, if you could handle the shock. And some people just didn't wipe. Or did the medieval version of the squat and shuffle. No documentation, thankfully, but enough clues exist to suggest that thorough hygiene was more of a suggestion than a rule. Oh, and water? Forget it. Bathing was rare. Using water to clean your backside was rarer still, especially in winter when rivers froze, and warm water had to be hauled by the bucket and heated over a fire. It just wasn't happening. Only in certain parts of the Islamic world, where bidet-style washing was common, did water-based cleaning see any consistent use. In medieval European castles, you'd have better luck asking for a scented candle and indoor plumbing. And while we're here, let's talk about the logistics of wiping in the garderobe. These were not spacious stalls with elbow room. They were tight, cramped stone boxes. You had to manoeuvre around multiple layers of winter clothing, wool, linen, sometimes armour, and balance over a hole while trying to keep whatever you were using from falling into the abyss. And if you dropped it, it was gone. Not going after it, not even thinking about it. This is why many castles didn't even provide wiping materials near the toilet. People brought their own. Whether it was a moss bundle tied with twine, a scrap of cloth kept in a pouch, or a handful of straw jammed into a belt, it was your responsibility, and heaven help you if you forgot. Imagine walking all the way across the castle, sitting down and then realising, no moss, no rag. Nothing but regret and cold stone. Servants sometimes laid out supplies ahead of time, especially for nobles. But again, winter made everything harder. Cloth froze, moss crumbled, straw caught fire too easily. Even the process of prepping for a wipe could be a disaster. And if you were particularly unlucky, the wiping material might already be reused. Yes, shared rags existed, washed occasionally, passed between family members. Nothing says closeness like communal cloths in a frigid garderobe with no door latch. One odd fact, aromatic herbs were sometimes tied into the wiping cloths, not just for scent, but as a kind of magical protection. People believed that bad smells could carry disease, which isn't totally wrong. And so they'd stuff sage, lavender or rosemary into the folds of the cloth, hoping to purify both the experience and the soul. It didn't work, but it's charming that they tried. Scholars still argue about how much people cared about cleanliness back then. Some insist that medieval folk just accepted being filthy. Others suggest that they had very different standards, less about feeling clean in a modern sense, and more about avoiding visible grime or spiritual impurity. The truth probably lies somewhere in the middle. They wiped as best they could with what they had. Sometimes that meant a moss-covered stick, sometimes that meant nothing at all. So the next time you unroll that soft, quilted toilet paper with the cute bears on the packaging, take a moment, reflect, appreciate. Because somewhere, deep in the stone guts of a medieval castle, someone is crouching in the cold, fumbling with frozen moss and praying they don't drop it. You're living in the future, and the future is blessedly soft. Let's take a step back now, not literally, you're probably still mentally wiping with moss, and look at one of the more underrated elements of medieval bathroom culture, toilet hierarchy. That's right, even when it came to freezing your behind in a castle toilet, where you relieved yourself wasn't just about location or convenience, it was about status. In fact, the entire concept of using the bathroom in the Middle Ages was tangled up in social order power dynamics. And who had the privilege of not sitting over the worst shaft in the building? To put it bluntly, where you pooped said everything about who you were. Let's start at the top. The king, queen, dukes and other elite nobles didn't just have private garderobes. They had entire privy chambers, often connected to their bedrooms, and in some cases featuring elaborate furnishings, padded seats, and their own staff member dedicated to the royal rear. Yes, that was a real job. In the English court, the person was known as the groom of the stool, and their sole responsibility was to assist the monarch with bathroom duties. That included providing wiping cloths, managing chamber pot maintenance, and perhaps most horrifying, recording the king's bowel movements for health tracking. And this wasn't some lowly job. The groom of the stool was often a noble himself, sometimes even a close advisor, because nothing says political trust like wiping the king's royal backside and then helping him draft legislation 5 minutes later. It's intimate, it's unsettling, and it's so very medieval. But what about everyone else? High-ranking nobles usually had guardrobes built directly into their bedchambers or private towers. These were small, stone enclosures with their own chutes and, if they were lucky, enough distance from the stables or kitchens to keep the smell from becoming part of the interior decor. In winter, these rooms were still freezing and awful, but at least they were exclusive freezing and awful. The seat might be smoother, the shaft might be longer, allowing waste to fall far below. You might even have a window, glass, not likely, but a hole at least. Then came the household knights, chamberlains, and favoured guests. These folks had access to semi-private garderobes, not inside their rooms, but close by, maybe down the hall shared with 2 or 3 others. It was like the medieval version of a shared bathroom in a nice Airbnb. No privacy, sure, but better than the alternatives. And then there were the servants. Oh, The servants. Servants didn't get private toilets, they didn't get padded benches or doors that actually latched. Most of them used communal garderobes, often built in a remote corner of the castle, close to the outer wall and far away from anyone important. These spaces were built for utility, not comfort. Think stone bench with multiple holes, side by side, 0 partitions, 0 shame. It wasn't uncommon for half a dozen servants to use the room at once, chatting awkwardly or sitting in uncomfortable silence while they waited for the person next to them to finish up. Talk about team bonding. And in winter, it only got worse. The servant garderobes weren't insulated, barely maintained, and sometimes clogged from months of heavy use. Wasteful froze in the chute stacked up below and left a stench that clung to your clothes like guilt. If the main chute got blocked, the backup system was, get this, a bucket. One bucket, for every inn, replaced when someone remembered. Welcome to the bottom of the feudal food chain. Some of the lowest ranking workers, like stable hands and cook's assistants, didn't even use the castle's facilities. They were expected to go outside, behind the stables, behind the kitchens, wherever there was a patch of snow and enough privacy to avoid scandal. And yes, they squatted in full winter clothing, sometimes barefoot, usually miserable. Their toilet was the ground. And their paper? Probably not even moss, just a handful of snow and a whispered prayer to survive the next few minutes without slipping and falling into their own disaster. Monks and nuns, by contrast, had a different kind of toilet politics. In many monastic communities, bathroom use was dictated by rules of silence, humility, and communal living. The latrine, called the riridorta, was often a large stone room built over a flowing stream, with multiple seats and no partitions. Modesty was considered less important than efficiency. You were there to cleanse the body and mind, not gossip or be comfortable. Of course, in winter, the water sometimes froze, the stone seats bit into your soul, and monks still had to squat in silence. But at least the riridorta theoretically kept things flowing. One fun fact, in some castles, the order of use for guardrobes was enforced. Servants cleaned and prepped the room first, nobles used it afterward. If someone entered out of turn, say a kitchen maid wandered into the lord's private toilet, they could be punished. Sometimes with loss of wages, sometimes publicly shamed. Because again, in a world where everything was ranked, so was your access to warmish stone slabs to sit on. Even guests had to play the toilet status game. Visiting nobles were expected to bring their own chamber pot like a medieval sleepover essential, and would often be assigned a specific garderobe for the duration of their stay. If the host really liked you, you got one near the fire. If not, you were climbing a freezing tower at 3 a.m. just to take a regrettable seat above a pit of last year's mistakes. And don't even ask about prisoners. Held in castle dungeons, these poor souls had no facilities at all. Their toilet was usually a corner of the cell or a hole in the ground, if they were lucky. Waste built up, sometimes freezing into uneven, reeking layers. In winter, the dungeon stench became unbearable. Guards wouldn't enter. Rats thrived, and if you were down there long enough, your waste might freeze before you could even finish. The sheer indignity of it all was honestly part of the punishment. This social pecking order of poop may sound absurd to us now, but to medieval people, it made perfect sense. Your place in the system, your rank, defined everything. What you ate, where you slept, who you married, and yes, where and how you did your business. The higher you stood, the longer your chute, the cleaner your cloth, the softer your seat. The lower you were, the closer you sat to disaster, both figuratively and literally. So next time someone tries to say everybody poops as a reminder of human equality, you can gently remind them, yes, everybody poops. But in medieval castles, not everybody got to do it with dignity. Now let's turn down the lights a little more, because this part of the journey gets tense. We're heading into siege territory. You've endured the cold toilet seat, chipped frozen waste out of stone walls, wiped with something that might have once been moss, and managed to keep a shred of dignity intact. But now the castle's under attack, the drawbridge is up, the gates are barred, and the food supply is on strict rationing. And that leaves you with one very pressing question. Where do you go to the bathroom when you're trapped in a freezing fortress for weeks or months during the siege? Answer: you don't want to know, but we're going there anyway. First, some context. A medieval siege was less about storming the gates with swords and catapults, though that happened, and more about starving your enemies into surrender. The attacking army would surround the castle and wait, sometimes for months, until food ran out, morale collapsed, or something inside the walls broke down. And while we always talk about the shortages of bread and meat and clean water, rarely do we hear about what really broke people: sanitation. Because you can stretch your food supply, you can drink watered down beer, but when the toilets stop working, that's when the real suffering begins. In a normal winter, the guardrobes were barely tolerable, but during a siege they became weapons against the defenders themselves. Waste piled up quickly, more people meant more use, and the cold didn't help anything break down. Cesspits overflowed, chutes froze solid, the stench became unbearable. And here's the kicker: you couldn't go outside to dump anything. Stepping outside the walls was a good way to catch an arrow to the chest. Even tossing waste over the edge became risky, since it could alert enemy scouts to your location, or worse, give them a target for their next flaming projectile. So people got creative, and by creative I mean desperate. Chamber pots became the front line of bathroom survival. Every room had one. Every hallway had backups. These pots would fill up quickly, and when the weather dropped low enough, the contents froze into jagged, fecal ice sculptures. Servants were supposed to carry these to designated dumping spots inside the castle, usually a storage room or unused cellar, now repurposed as an indoor latrine. These spaces were nightmarish, cold, dark, slick with moisture, and packed wall to wall with what one chronicler charmingly described as the collective burden of a suffering garrison. If that's not enough, consider this. With water frozen and fuel scarce, you couldn't clean anything. So after using your chamber pot, you'd just leave it, full, and pray it didn't crack from the cold or tip over in the chaos. Entire families shared the same pot. Guests shared with hosts, soldiers shared with civilians. Privacy was dead, and so honestly was hygiene. Eventually, the smell began to choke the castle. With no airflow and everyone trapped inside, waste odours became so intense that people stuffed cloth soaked in herbs up their nostrils just to breathe. Nobles who had once insisted on perfumed handkerchiefs now walked around with damp bundles of hay under their cloaks just to dull the air. The garderobes, already suffering under normal conditions, were overwhelmed. Frozen chutes turned into icy cliffs of decay. The usual cleaning staff either refused to work or had frozen solid trying. Some castles attempted to rig up emergency systems. A few forward-thinking architects had built secondary garderobes or privy shafts that emptied into hidden ditches or dry moats. These could be used during a siege, assuming no one outside noticed. But once the enemy figured it out, those outlets were blocked, targeted, or used as entry points. Yes, that's right. Some invaders tried to enter castles through the toilet chutes. It wasn't common, because even medieval soldiers had standards, but it happened. And if you were a defender, the last thing you wanted was a literal enemy crawling up through the frozen poop shaft with a dagger in his teeth. So how bad did it really get? Well, there's one siege, Chateau Gaillard 1204, where defenders were trapped for so long that human waste was dumped from the walls directly onto the cliffside below. Over time, the build-up became so hodge and so rank that some attackers refused to advance near it. In other words, the castle literally created a wall of crap for defence. Cold weather helped it solidify. It was effective. It was horrifying. It was medieval. Back inside, things weren't going well. People became sick, not from hunger, but from their own waste. Dysentery broke out easily, especially when clean water became scarce. And in the cold, those infected had nowhere warm to rest. They still had to use frozen garderobes, or sit over cracked pots, often in shared spaces. The psychological impact can't be overstated. You're starving, freezing, and every time you go to relieve yourself, it's a full-body nightmare and memory with no guarantee that the pot won't already be overflowing. Desperate measures followed. In some castles, waste was burned. People threw dried excrement into fireplaces to get rid of it. This was dangerous, disgusting, and toxic. But in a siege, nothing was off the table. Others tried burying it under snow inside the courtyard. But snow melts, and when it did, it revealed the world's worst Easter egg hunt. Eventually, even the nobles had to face the grim reality. The castle was becoming its own worst enemy. Some noble families evacuated their living quarters and moved into storage rooms or towers simply to escape the growing stench. Bedding was ruined, clothing reeked, rats thrived, and no one, no matter how high-born, could pretend their chamber pot wasn't slowly becoming a frozen monument to human desperation. And yet, ironically, this awful situation wasn't always a disadvantage. Some castles weaponized their own waste during sieges. buckets of human filth were dumped over walls onto attackers. Cesspit runoff was poured into moats to contaminate water supplies. Defenders even catapulted excrement, sometimes mixed with corpses or infected materials, over the walls in a gruesome attempt at biological warfare. It was rare, it was extreme, and it was revolting. But in the depths of winter, when swords froze to scabbards and morale dipped to its lowest, every frozen bucket became a potential bomb. So to sum it up, winter sieges turned castles into toilets. Not metaphorically, literally. Every hallway, every tower, every spare corner of stone filled with the inescapable consequences of hundreds of people all trying to survive without a working bathroom. No amount of perfume, no title, no castle walls could keep the stink out. In the end, many castles didn't fall to battering rams or hunger. They surrendered because they were dying in their own filth. And in that frozen, reeking quiet, you start to understand, sometimes history isn't written in blood or gold, but in frozen waste and chamber pots piled high behind barricaded doors. By now, you've experienced the sheer horror of freezing garderobes, exploding cesspits, and chamber pots that doubled as weapons during sieges. But medieval castle life wasn't just physically painful, it was also weirdly spiritual, full of superstition, strange customs, and some of the most curious beliefs ever associated with the act of going to the bathroom. So tonight, as the wind howls around the turrets and the frost creeps across your window pane, we're going to explore the stranger side of medieval toileting. Frozen flatulence, bathroom folklore, and the absolute terror of laughing while doing your business. Let's start with the fart, shall we? In the modern world, passing gas is awkward, maybe funny, maybe mortifying depending on your location. But in the Middle Ages, it came with superstitious baggage. People genuinely believed that farts could carry illness, evil spirits, or even sin, especially in the cold. Why the cold? Because winter was when people huddled together indoors, where smells lingered longer, and old ideas about bad air, miasma, became tangled with religious fear and survival-level hygiene. Flatulence was seen by many as an unfortunate but revealing occurrence. Some believed that an ill-timed fart, especially during prayer, meals, or sacred moments, was a sign of spiritual impurity. If it happened in church, you could be fined or forced to perform acts of penance. If it happened in the presence of nobility, you'd pray to every saint you knew that they had a sense of humour. In castles, it was often not a laughing matter, unless, of course, it was. See, toilet humour actually existed in medieval times. Fart jokes appear in manuscripts, plays, and even religious texts. Some monks were surprisingly witty when it came to bodily functions. The problem was, humour and shame were deeply intertwined. You could laugh about a night's ridiculous flatulence in a story told by the fire, but if someone laughed during the act of defecation, especially in winter, when discomfort made emotions unpredictable, that was considered bad luck. Or worse, a moment when you were vulnerable to possession. Yes, possession. In some parts of Europe, there was a widespread belief that the garderobe shaft could allow demons to enter the body. Think about it. You're squatting over a deep, dark, frozen hole in the wall, literally exposing your most sensitive area to the unknown. In the cold, with your teeth chattering and the stone beneath you whispering every sound down the chute. It wasn't hard to imagine something reaching up from the abyss. Superstitious folks believed that laughing in that moment could invite something in, a spirit, a demon, or simply bad fortune. To protect themselves, many people would say a prayer before using the toilet. A quick blessing, a whispered plea to a saint, St. Elmo and St. Benedict were favourites, and sometimes a hand symbol or charm tucked into the folds of clothing. In some castles, tiny crosses were carved above or beside the toilet hole. Not for decoration, these were meant to guard the soul during evacuation. Because when your physical guard was down, your spiritual defences had to be on full alert. The fear didn't stop there. People believed that evil spirits could be trapped in waste, especially when it froze. A freezing garderobe became a kind of demonic fridge, preserving bad energy until the spring thaw when it could escape. That's why some castles performed purification rituals in early spring, burning herbs near the garderobes, offering symbolic cleansings of the waste shafts, and in some cases, reading scripture aloud in privy towers. And then there was the wind. Oh, the wind. The cruel drafts that shot up through the toilet chute were seen not just as cold air, but as omens. If the wind blew strong while you were seated, it was believed that a spirit had passed through, or worse, was trying to sneak in. Some people tied charms around their ankles or wore iron rings to ward off supernatural attention during these vulnerable moments. Others simply clenched harder and hoped for the best. In folklore, there were tales of toilet ghosts too, spirits that haunted the garderobe, particularly in castles with a dark past. One legend tells of a jester who died by falling into the pit during a drunken prank, and now returns every winter night to giggle beneath the seats. Another castle in Wales reportedly had a woman in white, known locally as the Privy Bride, who appears near the toilet shaft of the West Tower, always sobbing, always cold. Some believe she died during a siege, having locked herself in the garderobe to escape, only to freeze to death alone and unrelieved. Even animals got tangled up in the bathroom superstitions. Cats were sometimes seen lingering near the garderobe during winter nights. This was either considered a bad sign — cats were often linked with witchcraft — or a protective one, depending on your family's beliefs. If the cat hissed at the shaft, it meant a spirit was near. If it sat peacefully, your bowels were blessed. Go figure. But for all this fear, there was also humour. Castle dwellers, especially those stuck inside for long winters, often made toilet jokes to cope with the sheer awkwardness and discomfort of it all. Songs were written about flatulence, ridiculous nicknames were given to overused garderobes. Someone would inevitably name the worst-smelling privy the Dragon's Mouth, or Satan's Elbow. Kids dared each other to peek down the shaft. Teens carved graffiti into the wooden seats. Even monks occasionally left humorous drawings in the margins of their illuminated manuscripts, tiny impish characters blowing gas at startled bishops. It was a strange mix of reverence and ridiculousness, fear and fart jokes, spiritual dread and coping laughter. Because what else can you do when it's 5 degrees below freezing, your breath is fogging up the toilet air, and you're squatting over a haunted hole in the wall? You joke, you pray. You wrap your moss tight and hope nothing ancient grabs your ankle. So the next time you hear someone scoff at medieval people, like they didn't understand science or live with weird beliefs, remember this: they weren't ignorant. They were scared, cold, vulnerable, and trying to make sense of a world where bathroom trips could be fatal, humiliating, or spiritually dangerous. And through it all, they still managed to tell jokes, sing songs, and warn their children not to laugh too loudly over the shaft. Because in a castle in winter, laughter might just wake up something old, something cold, and something very, very grumpy. Now that we've gotten a good look at medieval toilet folklore, let's return to the all-too-real horrors of castle life with a deep dive into the absolute worst job you could have in that frosty stone labyrinth. The gong farmer. Yes, we mentioned them earlier. But tonight, we're going to crawl very carefully into their world and stay a while. Because if anyone deserves more than just a passing nod, it's the poor soul who spent their nights knee-deep in frozen human waste while everyone else slept warm and clueless in feather-stuffed beds. Welcome to the tragic, toxic, and truly unbelievable life of a medieval gong farmer. First things first, no one chose to be a gong farmer. You didn't wake up as a young child in medieval England thinking, one day, I'll climb into a dark hole full of nobleman turds and make something of myself. No, gong farming was either inherited — if your father did it, so did you — or it was your last available option. Maybe you were an outcast, a criminal, a desperate peasant, or just really down on your luck. And when that happened, your reward was a job that combined the danger of coal mining, the stench of a slaughterhouse, and the public prestige of a diseased mule. The actual work? Brutal. Gong farmers were responsible for clearing out cesspits, garderobe shafts, and any other space where waste collected, which, in winter, meant frozen piles of compacted filth that had to be broken apart by hand, not with a cute little snow shovel. With iron tools, wooden buckets, and often just their bare hands wrapped in oiled rags. No gloves, no safety goggles, no dignity. Now imagine crawling into a garderobe chute from below. You're in a narrow, icy tunnel, crouched in sludge that's been fermenting for decades, and you're trying to chip away at what might as well be frozen brown limestone. The air is thick with ammonia, the stones are slippery, your lantern keeps going out because the draft is too strong, and you're working fast, because if someone upstairs decides to use the toilet mid-shift, well, you get the idea. Let's just say you hope they had good aim. Winter made everything worse, not just because of the cold, but because frozen waste expands. That meant cracks into stone walls, sudden ruptures, and ice-lodged filth pressing outward with glacial pressure. Gong farmers sometimes had to tunnel into waste blocks as hard as rock, carving out channels just to get the stuff moving. If you've never imagined a grown man with a pickaxe chipping away at a frozen poop wall by torchlight while muttering prayers, now you have. And yet despite all this, gong farmers were paid relatively well. sometimes even double what an average labourer earned. Why? Because no one else wanted the job, and those who did it were often literally essential to keeping castles livable. If the guardrobes backed up, or if the cesspits overflowed, disease could rip through the castle like wildfire. So these guys, as revolting as their work was, were the only line of defence between daily life and a full-scale sanitation disaster. But don't get too comfortable thinking they were well respected. Gong farmers were legally required in many cities to work only at night, hence the nickname night men. They weren't allowed to walk through town during the day, not because they were a nuisance, but because people claimed they smelled so bad it made others sick. Some communities banned them from entering churches, others forced them to live in certain districts, far away from markets, bakeries, or anywhere people gathered. And you'd think, surely they at least got to wear protective clothing. Nope. Their gear consisted of patched cloaks soaked in wax or lard to repel moisture, thick boots, when they had them, and scarves or mouthcloths to breathe through. Many carried herbs like rosemary or mint under their noses to fight the constant stench. Others just stopped caring and lost their sense of smell altogether, a real documented condition among sanitation workers of these time. If they dropped a tool, they had to fish it out. If a bucket handle broke mid-haul, start over. If a rat bit them, and rats loved cesspits, especially in winter, they risked infection, fever, or worse. There are even stories of gong farmers passing out from the gases that built up in deep, unventilated pits. Methane, hydrogen sulfide, and ammonia swirled into toxic clouds below ground level. A single misstep. One poor decision to light a torch at the wrong time, and boom, instant inferno. Yes, people exploded doing this job, and yet they kept going, night after night. Shoveling, scraping, hauling. Sometimes they dumped the waste in designated pits outside the castle, where it was left to rot or used as fertiliser. Other times, especially during winter when the ground was too hard to dig, they had to stack it somewhere inside the walls, usually in a storage room that no one would dare enter. The smell seeped through the stone. It always found a way. Now, not all castles had full-time gong farmers. Smaller keeps might rely on servants to do the job part-time, which meant rotating shifts of young, terrified workers being sent down into the shaft with no training. Accidents happened, falls, disease, slips. One slip in the wrong place and you could drown in what the Lord had for dinner last week. That's not a joke. That's a real historical danger. There are even fringe legends about gong farmers finding lost treasures while cleaning cesspits, rings, coins, even daggers that had accidentally fallen down the shaft. But no one really wanted to reclaim those items, even if they were cleaned. Once it had gone into the pit, it was considered cursed. And who's going to wear Grandma's ring once it's been marinating in frozen excrement for 6 months? Not even medieval people were that bold. Despite their importance, we know surprisingly little about individual gong farmers. Their names weren't often recorded, they didn't get tombstones or written eulogies. They just did their work in the dark, cleaned up what no one else would, and disappeared. If they were lucky, they lived to pass the job on to someone else, usually a relative. If they weren't, well, their story probably ended in a pit somewhere. And yet, if you're imagining them as shuffling, hopeless figures, think again. Some were sharp, sarcastic, and knew the castle better than anyone else. They had keys to locked passages. They overheard secrets during midnight shifts. They moved freely through every part of the building, unseen, unnoticed, and sometimes dangerously informed. There are whispered stories about gong farmers who blackmailed nobles with what they knew. After all, when you handle someone's filth every night, you know exactly where they've been. So yes, their job was disgusting. Yes, it was dangerous. Yes, it was cold and miserable and filled with spiritual, emotional and nasal trauma. But in the frozen guts of a medieval castle, the gong farmer was the silent guardian of basic human dignity. And without them, even the grandest halls and warmest hearths would have collapsed under their own waste. Next time you flush a toilet and walk away without a second thought, give a quiet nod to the forgotten figures of history, those who faced the cold, the stink and the darkness so no one else had to. Let's take a break from the labourers and turn our lantern toward a different kind of nightmare, the one that lived inside the noble mind. Because while servants shovelled and peasants squatted in the snow, the lords and ladies of the castle were dealing with a whole different kind of medieval trauma. Shame. And winter didn't make it easier. In fact, the season made everything worse. You see, in a world obsessed with honour, dignity, and the illusion of grace, Nothing shattered your social standing faster than a toilet-related embarrassment. Welcome to the frigid world of frozen castles and burning shame. It might surprise you to know that the upper classes were just as vulnerable to humiliation as the lowest scullery maid, perhaps even more so. Because when you're a noble, expectations are sky high. You're supposed to glide through life in fur-lined robes, whispering orders, perfumed and poised, untouchable. But what happens when you need to go to the bathroom, and your chamber pot cracks in the middle of the night, spilling last night's venison stew across the flagstones? Or when your foot slips on a frozen puddle outside the garderobe and you land, quite literally, in a pile of your own legacy? It happened. A lot. Let's start with the most common shame of all. Accidents. In winter, everything froze. The seats, the floors, the chamber pots. You've heard this already, but now imagine the noble context. You're at a feast. There's music, dancing, wine, laughter. You're wearing 5 layers of fine wool laced up with cords wrapped in fur, and then you feel it. The stomach cramp. The growing pressure. But to reach the garderobe, you have to wind down 2 freezing corridors, past the kitchen, around the main hall and up a tower. By the time you get there, if you get there, nature might have already taken its course. And that, for a noble, was a reputation ender. In courtly life, bodily control was directly linked to moral control. Losing that control even once could stain your name. Gossip spread like wildfire through castles, and there was nothing people loved more than a fall from grace. Did you hear? Lady Isolde had an incident near the chapel steps. During Vespers? No less. There were no secrets. Servants talked. Guards whispered. By the next morning, your little midnight mishap had become the talk of the hall. That fear of embarrassment drove some nobles to extremes. It's documented that certain high-status individuals, particularly women, would fast during long events just to avoid having to use the facilities. Others had emergency chamber pots kept under their banquet chairs, hidden behind tapestries or tucked into alcoves for quick silent relief. And let's be clear, no one wanted to use those. The process was awkward, risky, and always carried the possibility of audible betrayal. In the cold, there was no muffling anything. Some nobles even assigned toilet guards, servants whose entire job was to stand outside the garderobe or chamber door to ensure privacy and to intercept any potential witness to shame. These poor souls had to act as bodyguards for bodily functions, pretending not to notice any noises, smells, or catastrophes. But they noticed. Oh, they noticed everything. And if they talked, heads could roll, quite literally. The worst-case scenarios made their way into castle lore. One nobleman reportedly fell asleep on the garderobe during a winter's night, and, because of the cold, the wine, or both, fell in. He was found the next morning wedged in the shaft, very much alive and very much humiliated. His household claimed he'd been praying in solitude. No one believed it. He was never invited to court again. Another legend tells of a young lady in waiting who during a feast excused herself and tried to rush to the garderobe, only to slip on the icy stair, land badly, and let's just say she didn't need the garderobe by the time she got there. She tried to return to the hall as if nothing had happened, but the evidence followed. She left the castle that night, never to return. Her name survives only in a crude rhyme sung by kitchen boys decades later. And then there's the truly medieval solution to shame, punishment. Yes, sometimes toileting mishaps weren't just laughed at, they were punished. If a servant fouled a noble's chamber or used the wrong pot, they might be whipped, fined, or even dismissed. If a guest disgraced themselves in a shared space, they could be publicly mocked or barred from future events. In one German castle, it's recorded that a lower-ranked noble was forced to clean the garderobe shaft himself after using it improperly. Whether he misaimed, used someone else's seat, or simply lingered too long is unclear. What is clear, the shame broke him. He left for a monastery within the year. Of course, winter made everything harder. Imagine being bundled in layers of stiff woolen fur, needing to relieve yourself quickly, and being expected to do it gracefully. Removing garments took time. The cold made fingers numb, buckles stiff, and the whole process longer than anyone liked. One noblewoman reportedly fainted in a garderobe after spending 20 minutes trying to untie her underlayers with frozen hands. Her maid found her slumped on the seat, blue-lipped, barely conscious, and still mid-process. They told the court she had a vision. Again, no one believed it. Now, some nobles had their own custom garderobes built to avoid these humiliations. Wider seats, thicker doors, better airflow. or proximity to fireplaces, but even these luxuries couldn't prevent human error. Pipes still froze, pot content still cracked, and winter doesn't care about your family crest. So what did nobles do to protect themselves? Beyond the fasting, beyond the guards, some resorted to magical protection, amulets to prevent bowel trouble, herbal sachets sewn into underclothes, runes carved into toilet doors. One surviving charm reads, "By St. Giles, let no foul air or shame befall me." That's bathroom anxiety, 13th century edition. And while the shame fell hardest on nobles, because they had the most to lose, it trickled down through the ranks. Pages dreaded being the ones to empty the lady's chamber pot, fearing a spill. Maids feared leaving behind a scent. Cooks feared being blamed for unfortunate results. It was an ecosystem of anxiety, frozen in stone and sealed with superstition. In a modern world where plumbing is silent and private, it's easy to forget how loud and public the bathroom experience once was, especially in castles, especially in winter. And especially when your name, your title, and your marriage prospects could all crumble because you slipped or cracked a pot or made an unfortunate noise at the wrong moment. So if you ever find yourself embarrassed in a public restroom, just remember, at least no one is going to write a ballad about it. In medieval times, you weren't so lucky. We've lingered in noble chambers, survived siege-induced chamber pot avalanches, and even whispered about ghosts with bowel grudges. But now we descend into something darker, colder, and altogether more claustrophobic, the toilets of the imprisoned. Because not everyone in a medieval castle was sipping mulled wine in front of a hearth. Some were shackled in the depths of the tower, behind locked doors, in cells where rats were better company than jailers. And when those prisoners needed to relieve themselves during winter, well, they didn't get a seat. They didn't get a choice. They got what was available, and that, friends, was usually a hole in the corner, if they were lucky. Let's set the scene. You've been accused of treason, or heresy, or maybe you just looked at a nobleman the wrong way. Either way, you found yourself tossed into a stone-walled dungeon carved beneath a castle tower. It's winter. The cold seeps through every crack. There's no fire. The air smells like mould, iron and despair. And the worst part? You've been given no food, no blanket, no explanation, but your stomach still works. And eventually, as all humans do, you feel that familiar pressure. In many castle dungeons, there was no designated toilet area at all. The floor sloped slightly toward a drain if you were lucky. If not, the waste just accumulated in the corners. Some cells had a hole, maybe dug into the floor, sometimes nothing more than a recess in the stone. In a few luxurious prisons, and yes, that's a sarcasm, there was a gutter or trench cut into the edge of the cell to collect waste, angled to let it run down into a pit below. But again, winter changed the rules. These systems froze, waste hardened, trenches clogged. And suddenly your cell wasn't just a prison. It was a personal cesspit. Now, if the prisoner was high-ranking, deposed noble, a disgraced knight, they might be kept in a semi-private chamber with an actual garderobe built into the wall. But even this was no kindness in winter. With no fire nearby and a shaft that howled like a banshee in the wind, the cold turned the space into a torture chamber. It's one thing to be chained by the ankle. It's another to have your one place of relief become the coldest, darkest part of your cell. Imagine squatting over a wind tunnel, trying not to slip on the ice crust forming around the seat, all while being watched through a slit in the door by a bored, soup-drinking guard. In solitary cells, guards often didn't even bother with waste removal. Prisoners were expected to go in a corner, maybe over a bucket, and live with it, for weeks, in freezing temperatures. Archaeological digs in the Tower of London and other historic sites have found thick layers of human waste compacted into prison floors, some of it frozen in place by centuries of damp and cold. It wasn't cleaned up, it just became part of the room. If you were being tortured, and yes, many prisoners were, using the toilet became a form of humiliation. Guards would withhold food or water until prisoners soiled themselves. Then they'd mock them, or worse, make them clean it up with their bare hands. There are records of prisoners being denied chamber pots entirely as punishment, forced to squat over stones, chained in place in rooms with no ventilation. The cold didn't just make it worse, it preserved the evidence. The mess stayed frozen, and the smell, once it returned, was all the more potent. But not every prisoner was alone. In overcrowded cells, multiple people shared the same tiny space and the same toilet, if you could even call it that. These shared cells were a nightmare. Imagine 6 people crammed into a dark, wet room, shivering against one another for warmth, all sharing a single bucket or corner. No privacy, no dignity, just a constant battle to avoid stepping in something you didn't want to think about. There are reports of prisoners defecating into their own clothes because it was warmer than squatting on the floor. That's how desperate things got. Others scraped into the walls, creating shallow depressions to use as makeshift seats, little more than cold bowls of carved stone that filled up and froze over. One chronicle from a French prison describes inmates trying to urinate into cracks in the wall, hoping it would drain into the stones and disappear. It didn't. It just pooled and iced over, making the entire room a hazard. And here's the truly medieval twist. Some jailers used the prisoner waste as a control mechanism. Want a better cell? Clean your current one. Want a blanket? Haul your own chamber pot down the corridor. Want food? Use the bucket like a proper man and not the wall. It wasn't just cruel, it was calculated. The waste became a tool of power. Even in the freezing dark, your own bodily functions were weaponized against you. Now, a fringe but fascinating detail. Some prisoners actually escaped through waste shafts. It's rare, but it happened. The garderobe chute in some castles dropped far enough that if you were nimble and desperate, you could climb down into the pit below and make your escape. You'd be covered in human waste, freezing cold and possibly injured, but free. A few stories tell of inmates surviving such a route, crawling out through the pit during a snowstorm, disappearing into the night. Did they smell like victory? Absolutely not. But they smelled like freedom. One such tale, perhaps apocryphal but too good to ignore, comes from a 14th century German castle, where a noble prisoner allegedly bribed a servant to unlock the garderobe and then lowered himself down the shaft during a blizzard. The guard found his empty shackles the next morning, and the smell in the tower reportedly lingered for years. His name is lost, but the story remains, a human-shaped shadow slipping through frozen filth to escape tyranny. Of course, not everyone made it. Some tried and got stuck, or suffocated, or simply lost their nerve once the shaft narrowed and the smell became unbearable. These men died in the most undignified places imaginable, curled in the elbow of a waste chute. Frozen and forgotten. So while nobles feared shame and servants fought stink, prisoners endured the worst of all, the complete loss of humanity. No comfort, no choice, no relief, just a dark, cold cell with a stink that never faded, a floor that iced over with every breath, and a corner that reminded you every time you crouched over it that you weren't even considered worth a seat. And somehow in that filth, in that sequence, in that bone-deep cold, people survived. Alright, let's pull ourselves up from the dungeon floor carefully, and turn our attention to something a little more architectural, but no less gross. Because now we're getting into the guts of the castle, literally. Tonight, we're tracing the journey not just of people using toilets, but of what happened afterward. It's time to explore the plumbing, or the glorious freezing lack thereof behind medieval toilets, and especially how castles managed to sometimes keep things flowing in the dead of winter. Spoiler, they didn't really, but they tried. And the ways they tried range from clever to catastrophic. Let's begin with a basic truth. Medieval castles didn't have plumbing in any modern sense. No pipes, no water pressure, no taps. There were no underground sewer grids, no waste treatment and plants. What castles had were gravity, patience, and the willingness to accept that a lot of poop was just going to sit around for a while. But for all their limitations, some castles did attempt primitive plumbing, especially when it came to water and waste, and during winter those systems were put to the test. First, the water. Castles needed a water source. Some were built near rivers or natural springs, others had wells, deep hand-dug shafts reaching down to underground water tables. Getting that water to the upper floors, that was someone's back-breaking job. Buckets, yokes, pulleys, day after day, hauling liquid life up stone staircases. But for more innovative castles, there were cistern systems, stone tanks built into the walls or roof to collect rainwater. Rain would funnel down specially shaped gutters, flow through lead-lined channels and collect in the cistern. On a good day, this meant cold, somewhat clean water could be stored close to where people lived. On a bad day, it meant freezing, cracked reservoirs that became useless blocks of ice for months. Now, waste disposal. This was a bigger issue. The majority of toilets, garderobes specifically, relied on vertical chutes. Waste dropped through the shaft, ideally into a cesspit or a flowing moat. But clever architects tried to do more. In some castles, sluices were built, channels designed to carry water from a cistern or diverted stream through the base of the guardrobe shaft in order to flush the waste away. It was early plumbing, it was impressive, it also almost always failed in winter. Let's walk through the process. It's January. The air is cold enough to freeze ale in your mug. Water in the cistern. Solid ice. Stream, frozen. The sluice that was supposed to rinse the bottom of the garderobe chute? Clogged with ice and last month's regrets. Without flowing water, the waste doesn't move. It piles up, and once frozen, it becomes nearly impossible to clear without a full excavation team armed with iron tools and no sense of smell. Some castles tried to heat the water used in waste channels, but again, no central heat. Fires near waste chutes were dangerous. If the heat didn't ignite the methane gases wafting up from below, it often just melted the upper layer of frozen excrement, creating a half-thawed sludge that flowed back up the shaft when it had nowhere else to go. Imagine lighting a fire to clear the waste, and having a poop geyser burst into the guardrobe chamber. There are historical mentions, vague but colourful, of nobles screaming as the spirits of the pit returned in foul liquid form. You know what that was? Plumbing failure. Another challenge? Sloping drains. Some guardrobes were built with angled channels to help direct waste away from the castle. The idea was that gravity and occasional water flow would move everything down slope into a designated dump zone, usually outside the wall. But those channels were shallow, open and exposed to the elements. So during winter, what you had was a waste highway that froze solid, trapping everything mid-route. By February, it was less drain and more museum exhibit. Let's talk about castle moats. Romanticised as swan-filled love lagoons, moats were often just open sewers in disguise. Many garderobe chutes emptied directly into them. During winter, these moats froze over, trapping the waste beneath a thin crust of ice. If you were lucky, it stayed there. If you were unlucky, the ice cracked under someone's weight, maybe a servant fetching firewood, maybe a soldier on patrol, and down they went. Into the moat, through the surface, into the... You get it. That's not a water hazard. That's a biohazard. In some rare cases, castles had drainage tunnels built into the outer curtain walls, low or narrow passageways designed to direct waste and runoff away from the structure. These could be brilliant until the cold hit. Water that once flowed gently now sat stagnant, and any organic matter inside hardened like concrete. Rats loved these tunnels. So did thieves trying to sneak into the castle. Some would crawl up through waste drains, timing their heist for winter, when the smell was bearable and the tunnels were solid enough to climb. Imagine defending your home by dumping boiling oil at the gates while someone was quietly wriggling up the old waste sluice in the south wall. That's what medieval plumbing got you, a frozen security risk. Even castle kitchens had their version of plumbing problems. The sculleries, the washing areas, had to dispose of food waste and dishwater. In winter, those drains froze too, creating slippery cess rivers across the floors and into the walls. Frozen chicken grease plus soap plus human foot equals one broken ankle and a lawsuit, if lawsuits had been a thing. A few castles went full mad scientist and attempted underground latrines, using tunnels with the steep slopes and the gravel beds to filter and guide waste away from living quarters. These were rare and expensive, and again completely useless when the contents froze in place. Ever tried unclogging a 20-metre waste tunnel with a frozen compost slope? You haven't, but someone in the 13th century did, and they deserve a monument. Now, let's acknowledge the genius attempts, even if they failed. Some engineers tried using heated stones dropped into the drainage channels to thaw blockages. Others experimented with pouring boiling water down the chute, a dangerous but sometimes effective move. One particularly eccentric noble supposedly paid his servants to urinate down the chute in shifts to keep it warm and flowing. Desperate times, desperate measures. Scholars today debate how functional these early plumbing systems really were. Some argue they were more for show than substance, designed to impress visiting lords with the idea of sanitation. Others think they genuinely worked for part of the year, and just collapsed every winter like the rest of us. Either way, the evidence is clear. Plumbing in medieval castles was a seasonal affair, and winter was its mortal enemy. So next time you flush your toilet and it whooshes away without incident, take a moment. Remember that somewhere in a stone castle tower, a servant is crouched over a gutter, trying to thaw a frozen sluice with a torch and a prayer. Because when the waste didn't go away on its own, someone had to chase it, with a bucket, in the snow. Alright, it's time we address one of the strangest truths about castle toilets. The fact that, yes, poop could be used as a weapon. You've already seen how waste was dumped over walls during sieges, how it backed up and exploded, and how it even helped some prisoners escape. But castles weren't just palaces of passive suffering, they were designed for war, and sometimes that design included turning your bodily waste into part of the defence strategy. Tonight we're diving into the pungent world of architectural buttresses, and no, I'm not talking about the ones that support cathedral walls, I mean the ones that supported the cold, humiliating act of weaponising human filth. Let's start with one very real, very bizarre fact. Many guardrobes were intentionally positioned above vulnerable access points, castle entrances, sally ports, base walls, so that waste would drop not just away from the living quarters, but onto anyone trying to sneak in. That's not an accident, that's strategic placement. Because what's more discouraging than trying to scale a stone wall during a blizzard, only to get a slop bucket's worth of frozen waste dumped on your helmet? Picture it. You're an invader. You've braved icy terrain. You're wearing stiff leather armour and trying to climb a rope or ram a gate. You hear nothing at first. Just the wind howling and maybe the whisper of your fellow soldiers' boots crunching the frost. Then suddenly, a clattering of wood above you, a shout, and it's not hot oil pouring down. It's the unholy contents of the castle's communal latrine. Chilled, frozen in some places, sludgy in others, and definitely still warm in a few parts you don't want to think about. That moment, that's not just disgusting. That's psychological warfare. Some castles even had latrine turrets, little protruding stone boxes sticking out from high towers or curtain walls. These weren't decorative, they were functional. They let people relieve themselves without having to step outside the defences, but when placed over a gatehouse or side entrance, they also became gravity-powered defence mechanisms. Waste would accumulate in the chute, especially in winter when everything froze and backed up, and when the time was right, say during an enemy's push up the slope, someone could give it a good stomp or shove and unleash a winter's worth of stored misery onto the enemy below. This wasn't limited to siege tactics either. In some towns, waste was used as part of riot control. Seriously. In medieval London, for example, guards stationed at city gates sometimes emptied slop barrels onto unruly crowds. Snowy protest turned into wet brown nightmares. One chronicler described an incident where the people fled as the filth fell from above, screaming as they slipped upon the iced dung. That's not metaphor, that's Tuesday. But back to castles. The effectiveness of waste as a weapon didn't come just from its volume, it came from its smell, its slipperiness, and the diseases it carried. If you hit an enemy camp with a load of spoiled chamber pot runoff, you weren't just ruining their mood, you were possibly infecting them. Dysentery, typhoid, parasites. These weren't just bad luck, they were strategic hazards. In fact, some besieged castles used their waste deliberately, catapulting it over the walls or funneling it through hidden drains to foul the enemy's water supply. Let's talk about waste chutes as traps, too. In a few castles, notably in Scotland and Germany, garderobe shafts were designed to extend just far enough out from the wall that someone trying to enter through a small sally port or storm drain would walk directly beneath them. What does that mean? If you were sneaking in at night, your first warning that you'd been spotted might be impact, frozen or otherwise. And don't forget the moats. As discussed earlier, many castles emptied their guardrobes directly into the surrounding moat. In theory, this was practical. Moats were big, wet, and hard to access anyway. But in winter, when the surface froze solid, those same moats turned into giant icy toilets. Waste would pile beneath the ice. Sometimes defenders would break the ice on purpose and flood the moat with the stored contents during an attack. The resulting flood wasn't clean water, it was black water sludge, full of filth, frozen chunks, and who knows what else. Not great for morale, even worse for traction. Try running up an embankment covered in poop-slick ice while archers are aiming at your head. And here's a strange but true military tactic. Poop traps. Some defenders dug shallow pits just beyond the walls, filled them with human waste and covered them with thin wood or snow. Invaders crossing these areas, especially under cover of night, would fall in, triggering panic, injury and a serious desire to go home. Not quite a spike pit, but every bit as demoralising. Imagine your commander saying "hold the line" while you're up to your waist in the Lord's frozen leftovers. Now let's address the moral ambiguity here. Yes, weaponising waste seems cruel, maybe even barbaric, but remember, this was war. In winter, with no Geneva Conventions, You used what you had, and if what you had was several months of castle-generated excrement preserved by the cold like a fine medieval cheese, then so be it. It wasn't personal, it was strategy. There's even debate among historians about how intentional some of this was. Did builders really think, let's angle this garderobe chute so it lands right over the side entrance? Or did it just turn out that way? And someone later realised how handy it was? Hard to say. But the placement patterns are hard to ignore. Over gates, above narrow alleys, facing blind spots, coincidence, or tactical poop science. One fringe theory even suggests that in some cases, waste dumps were used as decoys. Picture this. During a siege, you know the enemy is watching. So you stage a dump of waste over a section of wall that's not being used, making them think it's heavily trafficked. They avoid it. Meanwhile, you're slipping troops in through a clean route. Gross misdirection at its finest. All of this, these stinking, freezing, foul-smelling defensive manoeuvres, reminds us that in a castle everything was dual purpose. The walls weren't just walls, the kitchen wasn't just for food. And the garderobe wasn't just for relief. It was, when winter hit and desperation rose, part of the castle's arsenal. So yes, in the right hands, or the wrong ones, waste became weaponry, carefully placed, frozen solid and dropped with brutal timing. Because when the snow was falling and the enemy was climbing and your options were limited, nothing said, you shall not pass, quite like gravity-fed, months-old human filth. You might be cold. You might be outnumbered, but up in that turret perched above the gate with a full bucket and a strong stomach, you still had the high ground. All right, time to climb back up from the moat and shake off the mental image of winterized waste traps, because we're about to head somewhere a little more luxurious, the royal garderobe. If you've been thinking that kings and queens had it easy when it came to medieval toileting, it's time for a reality check. Sure, they didn't have to chisel frozen poop out of stone shafts themselves or haul steaming chamber pots through icy corridors. But make no mistake, even monarchs suffered when it came to answering the call of nature in a freezing castle. Let's begin with the throne behind the throne, the close stool, while common folk squatted over the holes in the windy turrets or hunched over cracked chamber pots in the middle of the night. Kings and queens often used a specially designed piece of furniture called a close stool, a wooden chair with a hinged lid, a padded seat, and a chamber pot tucked discreetly beneath it. It was kept in or near the royal bedchamber, and served as the most refined toilet available at the time. Upholstered in velvet or brocade, sometimes with embroidered cushions and decorative carvings, it looked more like a seat you'd expect at a feast. Not something used for bodily functions, but even the fanciest chair couldn't save the royal backside from winter. Castles were notoriously cold, and even the monarch's chambers, while grand, were still surrounded by thick stone walls and thin glass windows, if any. During the depths of winter, the seat of the close stool was just as cold as the humble stone slabs in the garderobes. The only real difference, someone warmed it first. Enter one of the strangest, most intimate positions in court life, the groom of the stool. Yes, that was a real title. And no, it wasn't just a toilet joke. The groom of the stool was a high-ranking nobleman assigned to assist the king with his private needs, especially bathroom matters. In theory, this meant ensuring the monarch had a clean chamber pot, warm cloths or linen to wipe with, and a freshly scented room. In reality, it often meant being in the room while the king used the close stool, sometimes helping him undress, and yes, possibly assisting with wiping. Let that sink in. The man who held this job had access to the king's most private thoughts, most unguarded moments, and most unfortunate bowel-related accidents. During winter, the groom had additional duties, warming the seat by the fire before use, ensuring the chamber pot wasn't frozen over, yes, that happened, and adding herbal sachets to reduce the inevitable stench. It's said that some kings preferred their stool lined with warmed wool or fur, while others demanded rose petals sprinkled beneath the lid. And if the groom didn't perform these tasks to the royal standard, he didn't just risk demotion, he risked humiliation, because nobody wanted to be the courtier who gave the king frostbite on his rear. Now, queens had their own version of this arrangement, with ladies-in-waiting responsible for helping them navigate the many layers of gowns, corsets, and winter cloaks. Royal women rarely used garderobes unless travelling. Instead, they relied heavily on their own ornate close stools or chamber pots. These too were designed to look as little like toilets as possible. Elegant porcelain basins, lacquered wooden frames, sometimes even painted with flowers. But when it's below freezing and the pot has been sitting near a cold wall all night, it's not exactly a spa day. One historical account tells of Queen Elizabeth I's reluctance to leave her bed during especially harsh winters. Her stool was kept nearby, and multiple servants took turns warming linen to place beneath the seat before she sat. That's right, there was a rotating, fire-warmed toilet cloth schedule in the royal household. And still, there were complaints, cold floors, icy draughts, steam rising off the chamber pot, because no matter how royal you were, your bodily needs didn't care about your lineage. And speaking of draughts, one of the biggest challenges of winter toileting for royals was the location of their garderobes. Often built into the outer walls of towers for the ventilation, these stone closets became wind tunnels in cold weather. Even with thick robes and fur-lined garments, sitting down meant direct contact with the coldest air in the castle. Some monarchs refused to use these entirely during winter, preferring to stay indoors and to rely on chamber pots, which, of course, had to be emptied constantly by increasingly resentful staff. But what if they had to travel? Imagine the royal progress, a journey across the kingdom to visit distant estates or hold court in another stronghold. Winter travel was already miserable. Now add to that the problem of toileting on the road. Royals travelled with their own furniture, including their stools, which were packed and unpacked by servants, sometimes multiple times a day. There are surviving records detailing the transport of a king's privy apparatus, including pots, cloths, perfuming agents, and a collapsible seat with a velvet cushion. Not exactly travelling light. Even then there were mishaps. The stool might freeze during transport. A chamber pot might crack from the cold. Servants sometimes had to pre-warm the portable toilet in nearby kitchens before use, occasionally drawing laughter or ire if it didn't go smoothly. In one documented case, a royal chamber pot was mistaken for a soup bowl and nearly used at a banquet. That particular servant didn't last long, still being royal had its perks. While the castle servants squatted over stone chutes or hovered above icy buckets, the king had a footman to shield him from draughts and someone standing by with a fur-lined robe. Nobles might mock each other's fashion or politics, but no one dared joke about royal toilet routines, especially if they wanted to keep their heads. Of course, there were limits. When nature called urgently, even the king had to act fast. One record from a Scottish court reveals that during an especially cold winter, King James V used a chamber pot in the middle of a council meeting, screened off by a tapestry while advisors continued the discussion. That's multitasking, medieval style. And yet despite the luxury, despite the servants and the perfumed cloths, even royalty couldn't escape the basic discomfort of winter toileting. The rooms were still stone, the draughts still crept in, the water still froze, the pots still smelled. They could cushion the seat, light more fires, or drape themselves in fox fur, but at the end of the day, they too were humbled by the cold, miserable process of doing something utterly human. So the next time you sit down on a modern warm toilet, just remember, even kings and queens once winced at the chill, muttered curses under their breath, and scolded their servants for forgetting to preheat the seat, because in winter no crown could save you from the cold slap of a medieval toilet. So we've covered kings and queens shivering over their velvet-lined commodes, but now it's time to shine the icy spotlight on the other half of the medieval power couple, noble women, because while royal men had their grooms of the stool and their heated chamber pots carted around like crown jewels, the ladies of the cold lavatory had a whole different set of challenges. Let's just say when it came to answering nature's call in a freezing stone castle, women weren't exactly winning. First, let's talk clothing, because that was half the battle. In winter, a noblewoman might be wearing up to 6 layers. Linen chemise, woolen kirtle, velvet overdress, heavy cloak, corsetry or lacing, and often an underskirt or fur-lined petticoat. Now imagine needing to get all of that untied, lifted, adjusted, and out of the line of fire just to squat over a hole in a stone slab, or hover over a frozen chamber pot the size of a large soup bowl, all in a freezing garderobe that smells like despair and ammonia. Add gloves, too clumsy, remove gloves, say goodbye to your fingertips. And don't assume they had it easier indoors. Sure, they had private rooms, maybe even embroidered cushions and perfumed linen, but the seat didn't care who you were. It was still icy, still bit through every layer you wore. There are references, scattered in letters and household manuals, of noblewomen passing out from the cold while using the chamber pot, not fainting from modesty, literally losing consciousness from cold shock to the system, often in the middle of the night, in rooms with no fires and windows covered only in oiled parchment. Now, most noblewomen didn't just go alone. They had attendants, maids, ladies in waiting, sometimes even entire retinues depending on the occasion. If you were particularly high-ranking, your maid might help you undress, hold your skirts, warm the seat with a hot brick, or even hand you a scented cloth to bite down on so you didn't scream when your skin hit the frozen ceramic. But even with help, it wasn't glamorous. In fact, toileting was one of the few moments in a noblewoman's day where all the layers, etiquette, and ceremonial grace just fell apart. And that's where shame crept in. Women of status were expected to be delicate, silent, modest, even ethereal. But nature doesn't care about social norms, especially when it strikes in the middle of a royal banquet or during a freezing prayer vigil. Stories float through the centuries of noble women who had incidents in public, who couldn't reach the garderobe in time, or who simply refused to eat at winter feasts to avoid having to go at all. It wasn't just a matter of physical discomfort, it was a public identity crisis. If a lady had an accident, that could become her reputation. Forget her dowry, forget her embroidery skills. She'd be the woman who slipped on her own skirt in the garderobe and broke her ankle trying to hover. And speaking of hovering, let's talk logistics. Unlike men, noble women couldn't just pull aside a tunic and go. Even chamber pots were a challenge. There are mentions of women squatting backwards over their close stools to better position themselves, lifting all their skirts at once like a theatre curtain and hoping they didn't tip the pot in the process. Some used toilet stands, a kind of wooden frame to balance on, but those often froze in winter, making the wood slick and dangerous. One unfortunate duchess reportedly got stuck when the hem of her woolen cloak froze to the seat beneath her. It took 2 servants with boiling water to free her, and yes, everyone knew by morning. Now consider menstruation, which added a whole extra layer of complication. Noble women used linen rags or wool pads, often held in place by belts or simple ties. In summer, this was already uncomfortable. In winter, the cloths froze, the wool itched, washing them became near impossible. Water froze in basins, fires were reserved for cooking or warmth, not for menstrual laundry. So women often had to reuse cloths or wear frozen ones. If that sounds medieval, it was, and yet they still did it, with barely a whisper of complaint in public. Why? Because modesty demanded it, even among other women. Some, of course, were resourceful. Herbal sachets were worn around the waist to cover smells. Hot stones were placed near the privy chair to warm the surrounding air. Chamber pots were lined with dried moss or straw to reduce splash and ice. There are even records of women carrying their own miniature chamber pots, disguised as jewellery boxes or decorative vessels, to avoid using the communal garderobes. That's not just clever. That's innovation born from sheer desperation. But not every noblewoman had the luxury of hiding. In castles under siege, in travel, or in the countryside during hunts and winter festivals, they were often forced to squat behind trees, in snowy courtyards, or in makeshift tents with a chaperone holding a blanket for privacy. And in full winter dress, that meant undressing outdoors, quickly, while trying to balance on frozen ground with a breeze slicing through every layer of fabric. It was a process so awkward and miserable that some women simply refused to go. Ever. There's even one surviving letter from a 15th century noblewoman who writes to her sister, "My bowels ache with stubbornness, for I cannot bear the cold of the seat nor the smell of the passage." That's poetic constipation, medieval style, and let's not forget childbirth. Noble women often gave birth at home, in their chambers, surrounded by female attendants and midwives. That process, while wrapped in ritual, also meant days without access to a proper toilet, especially in winter, when moving a labouring woman across the icy floors was considered too dangerous. So chamber pots were used again and again and barely emptied in time. The rooms became steamy, smelly and cold, and yet they persisted, because what choice did they have? All of this makes one thing clear. So, some noble women weren't delicate dolls fainting in candlelight. They were tough, resilient survivors, enduring the same biological realities as everyone else, only with more fabric, more pressure, and far less privacy. They suffered in silence, frozen lace clutched in cold fingers, as they braved the daily indignities of medieval life with a kind of unspoken strength. So the next time you think about corsets and courtly dances, remember that behind every noble gown was a woman who once had to lift 7 layers of fabric just to perch on an ice-cold pot in the dark, hoping it didn't crack or spill. And if that isn't the definition of grace under pressure, I don't know what is. Let's take a quiet moment now to talk about something that's been lingering in the background this whole time. Smell. Not the metaphorical kind. The literal, nose-wrinkling, eye-watering, soul-shaking stench that clung to the corners of every medieval castle, especially during the freezing winter months when nothing evaporated, nothing dried, and nothing could mask the smell of 1,000 chamber pots trying to hibernate through a blizzard. Tonight, we're plunging into the pungent world of medieval air quality, or as it could more accurately be called, the age of indoor suffering. So here's the situation. You're inside a thick-walled castle. There's no central heating, no airflow system. The windows, if you have them, are maybe a foot wide and covered in waxed linen. The doors are heavy oak. Every fireplace is working overtime to keep the room even 1 degree above hypothermia. And everyone is trying to avoid stepping outside because the air out there could freeze your teeth. So what happens? The stink settles in. Guardrobes, of course, are the main culprits. These weren't sealed systems. There was no flush. Waste dropped into a pit, into a moat, into a chute, or sometimes just into a dark void of unknown depth. And in winter, when airflow dropped and ice clogged the exits, that smell didn't leave. It lingered. It crept back up the shaft. It made its way into nearby rooms, cloisters, and stairwells. You might be enjoying a game of dice in the next chamber, and suddenly catch a breeze that smells like 3-week-old goose stew, filtered through the digestive tract of a knight. Surprise! You're downwind of the northeast turret garderobe. And it wasn't just bathrooms. Every room in a castle added to the olfactory assault. The kitchens, constant grease, fish guts, burned bread, and ale spills. The Great Hall? A stew of unwashed bodies, sweaty furs, spilled wine, snoring dogs, and the occasional noble who hadn't bathed since Michaelmas. The cellars, mould, rotten barrels leaking fermented failure. The stables and kennels were close by, and if you lived on the lower floors, every snowmelt brought with it a trickle of animal waste from the upper courtyards. In the summer, at least, you could open a window, but in winter, everything stayed shut tight. Fires smoked, torches burned oily fat, and people rarely changed their clothes. Why? Because washing meant water, and water meant hauling buckets up icy steps, heating them for hours, and then standing naked in a freezing room while someone scrubbed you with sand and ash. Most people opted to just not. Which brings us to the body odour factor. You're wearing wool, you've been sweating in it for days, you sleep in it, you eat in it, you squat in it, and you're not alone. Everyone around you is doing the same. You know the old idea that medieval people didn't notice the smell because they were used to it? That's not entirely true. They noticed. They complained about it constantly. In letters, in poems, even in religious texts. One monk described the winter cloister of his abbey as a hothouse of sins and smells. Another noblewoman famously ordered her tapestries removed in midwinter because they had absorbed the foul breath of the lower servants. So what did people do to fight back? Enter the age of medieval air fresheners. First, herbs. People hung bundles of dried rosemary, lavender, mint or sage in guardrobes, hallways and near doorways. These were called strewing herbs, and in winter they were often soaked in warm oils and placed near hearths to release their scent. Did it work? Marginally. The scent might overpower a cold, quiet room, but against the full power of a castle's waste system, like throwing rose petals at a stampede. Second, incense. Churches used it regularly, but castles did too. Burning frankincense or myrrh was popular in noble households, particularly during winter festivals. The smoke disguised smells, sometimes too well. People would burn so much incense that the room became unbearable for other reasons. Coughing fits, eye-watering smoke, and in one case a documented fireplace fire started by a poorly placed censer full of burning cedar chips. Third, his perfume, not for the air, for the people. Nobles doused themselves in rosewater musk, civet, which, fun fact, comes from the anal glands of a small animal. Or ambergris, yes, that's whale bath. Anything to mask the funk. Winter was prime time for perfume because baths were scarce, and you could layer up the scent without sweating it off. It's no accident that medieval perfumeries did booming business from November to March. And then there were more experimental approaches. Some castle staff tried ventilation tricks, carving small vents above garderobe doors, opening arrow slits at specific angles to create a cross breeze. But in winter this just brought in more cold, so most people resigned themselves to living with it, or rather living in it. Now, here's a quirky historical footnote. There were smell-related superstitions too. People believed that bad air wasn't just unpleasant, it was dangerous. The idea of miasma, foul-smelling air causing disease, was widely accepted. So if a room smelled like death and mould and chamber pot overflow, it wasn't just uncomfortable, it was a threat to your soul. Some folks carried pomanders, small balls filled with spices and herbs, on chains around their necks. Others hung them near the bed, hoping the scented air would protect them while they slept. This fear of bad air is part of why people were so obsessed with scented items. Perfumed gloves, scented scrolls, herbal-infused oils for skin. In winter, when illness was everywhere and windows stayed closed, people leaned hard into the smell-based protection. Did it work? Probably not. But it was all they had. And yes, there were open debates about how to improve the situation. One 14th century architect wrote about designing garderobes with curved chutes to trap odours. Another recommended hanging wet linen in garderobe passages to catch the breath of filth. Neither solution worked particularly well. The truth was simple. When everything's frozen, clogged or stewing in a sealed room, no amount of mint leaves is going to save you. So how did people cope? Humour, resignation, passive aggression? Castle letters are full of references to the scent of Sir Richard's corridor, or complaints that the south stair smells like the devil's breath. One monk described the abbey latrine as a place fit for demons and foul thoughts. Poets turned it into metaphor. Servants turned it into gossip. And everyone, absolutely everyone, just tried not to breathe too deeply. In the end, winter in a medieval castle didn't just freeze your fingers, it smothered your nose. There was no escape from the smell. It crept under doors, climbed stairwells, and clung to furs like a second skin. And in that frigid, fragrant world, you learn to live with it, to cover it, or to laugh at it. Because really, what else could you do? Let's step back from the stench just a little and take a look at one of the more curious rituals in medieval castle life, the art of privacy. Because believe it or not, in a world of open halls, shared rooms, echoing corridors, and communal everything, people still desperately craved a moment alone. And nowhere did that desire become more intense, more dramatic, or more awkward than in the frozen corridors of medieval bathroom etiquette. Now you might think privacy was a luxury reserved only for the royals, and you'd be partly right. Kings and queens had their private chambers, sometimes a separate garderobe, and even a footman whose job was literally to make sure no one barged in mid-wipe. But for everyone else in the castle, from knights to cooks to scullery maids, privacy was a fantasy. And yet, it was still expected that people would somehow be discreet, proper, and well-mannered about the whole unpleasant business of relieving themselves. In the great halls, garderobes were often tucked away into narrow turrets, sometimes up a set of cold spiralling stairs, and sometimes down a tight hallway. The idea was to keep them physically distant from eating areas, but not necessarily hidden. The door? If it existed at all, it was a slab of creaking wood with a gap at the bottom, and more often than not, a chunk missing near the top. Sound insulation? Non-existent. Smell containment? Laughable. But if the door was latched, or more commonly, if someone hung a cloth over the opening, that was the medieval equivalent of a do not disturb sign. In some castles there were shared garderobes, yes, multi-seat bathrooms. Think long stone benches with several holes cut out, lined up side by side with absolutely no dividers between them. Imagine it, 4 or 5 people, shoulder to shoulder, squatting over a freezing pit and trying not to make eye contact. It wasn't just awkward, it was a social minefield. Who went where? Was there an unspoken hierarchy? Could you talk? Could you not talk? The answer is yes and no. If you were a servant and you entered a garderobe already occupied by someone of higher rank, you left. No question. You didn't apologise, you didn't bow, you just turned around and found somewhere else to go. If you stayed, you risked a beating, or at least a stern lecture about your station. On the flip side, if a noble walked in on a servant, they'd either ignore them completely, the best case scenario, or summon their steward to have the offender reassigned to waist duty until further notice. Rank mattered, even in the bathroom. But it wasn't just about class, there was a gender divide too. While some castles had separate garderobes for men and women, especially in monasteries or noble estates, many simply did not. Women had to time their visits carefully, often relying on attendants to scout the hallway first. If they heard someone already in there, they waited, in the cold, sometimes for a long time, because walking in on the wrong person wasn't just awkward, it could be interpreted as improper, flirtatious, or scandalous. A wrong glance at the wrong moment could start a rumour that lasted decades. That brings us to toileting schedules. Yes, they existed. In large households or monasteries, especially during winter, there were designated times for using the garderobe, morning, midday and evening, when people would line up or jostle politely to take their turn. In monastic settings, silence was enforced during these trips. The idea was to treat the act as a natural but private function, nothing to be laughed about and definitely nothing to talk about. But of course, people absolutely talked about it. Whispers travelled faster than fire in dry hay. If someone spent too long in the garderobe, or left looking pale, or made any kind of suspicious noise, people noticed. Servants gossiped about who always visited the same chambermaid before needing relief. Nobles teased each other over wine about who had the loudest exit echoes in the North Tower. And kids? Oh, they weaponised it. Mocking each other's bowel habits was basically a medieval rite of passage. Then there were the bathroom codes of conduct, unspoken rules that once broken earned you a permanent place in castle legend. Don't sing, don't whistle, don't grunt, don't talk to the person next to you unless you know them very well. Don't linger after finishing, and whatever you do, don't forget to bring something to wipe with. Nothing said a rookie, like walking out of a garderobe in winter without a fresh rag, a strip of moss, or if you were truly classy, a square of wool soaked in rosewater. Forget that, and you were doomed to waddle back to your chamber with a shameful expression, some shameful expression, and a long story to tell. But there were exceptions. Nighttime emergencies often threw all etiquette out the icy window. If someone had to go badly enough, especially during a snowstorm or after too much mead, they might sprint to the closest pot or chute regardless of who was already there. In those moments, privacy collapsed. Decorum disappeared. There are records of noble women who accidentally barged in on visiting ambassadors. One poor French baron was found weeping into his fur cloak after being walked in on by 3 different people while trying to relieve himself near the chapel garderobe. His crime? Using the wrong hour. There were also codes among servants, a sort of underground courtesy system. If 2 cooks needed to use the same pit, the older one got to go first. If someone was carrying night soil or a chamber pot, you gave them room, even if they reeked. And if a chambermaid accidentally soiled herself on duty, no one spoke of it. That was the rule, unless of course she was a rival. Then it was fair game. Interestingly, the farther down the social ladder you went, the more communal the experience became. In the servant quarters, large chamber pots might be shared by a whole group during the night. In barns or kitchens, people simply relieved themselves in corners during snowstorms, covered the mess with straw, and moved on. Privacy was a dream for the elite, but for the rest it was just another thing frozen solid by the realities of castle life. And even for the rich, privacy was never guaranteed. The walls were thin, the wind howled through every crack, and the echoes, could carry the most awkward moments down corridors and into nearby rooms. There are even accounts of people moving their beds away from garderobe adjacent walls because they couldn't stand the sounds. So yes, privacy mattered. Deeply. People did their best to respect it. Or at least pretend to, but in the end, no matter how many tapestries you hung or how many warning coughs you gave outside the door, someone eventually was going to hear what you were doing, and probably talk about it later. Because in a cold stone castle full of people with nothing better to do, there was no such thing as a secret squat. We've tiptoed through the chilly corridors of shame, suffered alongside squires with full bladders, and felt the icy sting of noble women perched above ceramic nightmares. But now, let's shift to something you might not expect from a world so heavily defined by discomfort. Innovation. Yes, hidden beneath the grime and freezing chamber pots, medieval castles were quietly full of people who weren't just surviving winter toileting, they were trying against all odds to improve it. Welcome to the strangely ambitious world of medieval toilet technology, where genius met excrement and sometimes they high-fived. First off, let's set expectations. Medieval innovation didn't mean plumbing as we know it today. No copper pipes or chrome levers. Instead, technology in this case meant clever uses of stone, gravity, airflow, and occasionally fire. Because why not make it more dangerous? And in a castle where every wall had to defend against siege and winter storms alike. The smallest tweak to how waste was managed could mean the difference between barely tolerable and a full-scale sanitation crisis. Let's start with garderobe positioning, an architectural choice that might sound dull, until you realise it involved flinging human waste over strategic parts of the castle. As mentioned before, garderobes were often placed high on outer walls, which allowed for gravity-powered disposal. But here's the clever bit. Many of these chutes were angled just so, designed to prevent backdrafts of smell, or to encourage freezing runoff to slide away instead of piling up. Some even included sluice slopes, shallow V-shaped cuts in the stone floor that directed liquid down and out. That's right, medieval toilets had their primitive drainage geometry. In elite castles, engineers started experimenting with multi-floor chute systems. Imagine a single shaft running from the third floor to the base, with garderobes feeding into it at each level. The waste would travel down the smooth interior, ideally ending up in a cesspit, or better yet, a filling moat. This was a big deal. It meant fewer cesspits to manage, fewer chamber pots to carry, and less effort during those brutal winter months when everything took twice as long. But here's where it got dicey. In freezing weather, those vertical shafts could become ice columns, especially when waste clung to the sides. One wrong move and the whole thing could freeze shut, causing backups and pressure that sent foul geysers upward. That's not innovation's fault, that's just physics with a cruel sense of humour. Now, some castles, especially those in warmer climates or owned by particularly obsessive lords, tried to get fancy. One example, stone seats with hidden vents designed to pull in fresh air from outside and redirect it upward through the chute. In theory, this created a kind of draft that carried smells away from the interior. In practice, if the wind changed, you got blasted in the face with a frozen gust of pure regret. Still, the idea was solid. Airflow mattered, even in a time when people were more likely to believe in demonic vapours than bacteria. Another clever trick: waste isolation. Some castles began building garderobes in pairs, separated by a shared stone wall with twin chutes, allowing servants to clean and maintain one inside while the other remained in use. This rotation method meant the waste shaft had a chance to freeze solid or thaw depending on the weather, reducing the risk of overflow. It also cut down on smell since fewer people used the same chute in rapid succession. And yes, that's medieval efficiency at its weirdest. Now, let's talk heat, or rather, the absence of it. In many castles, the only way to combat frozen waste was to melt it. Boiling water was the obvious answer, but it was costly, dangerous, and slow, so some clever folks tried using heated stones. Rolled or dropped down the chute to thaw blockages. Others used hot coals in iron pans dangled down by rope. It was risky because methane gases could ignite, but when the alternative was digging out frozen poop by hand, people were willing to gamble. Some of the most daring innovation came from monasteries. Monks, despite their vows of simplicity, were engineers in disguise. In places like Cluny Abbey, they built long, enclosed latrine galleries with running water flowing beneath them year-round, fed by nearby springs or redirected channels. These systems were so advanced for their time that historians still marvel at their design. The water not only flushed the waste, but helped control temperature and smell. Of course, in harsh winters, those same channels could freeze solid, turning the sleek system into a slippery death trap. But still, points for trying. There were also experiments with materials. Some castles replaced stone seats with wooden slats, which were warmer to sit on and easier to swap out if cracked or infested. Others tried lining chamber pots with straw, moss or wax cloth to insulate them against the cold and reduce cleanup. In a few rare cases, you see mentions of alchemical powders sprinkled into waste pits to reduce smell, early attempts at deodorizer, though mostly based in superstition and wishful thinking. Dragon bone dust, one recipe promised, will cause the excrement to flee of its own accord. Sure it will. One truly fascinating innovation: garderobe towers. Separate from the main structure, these towers housed multiple toilets stacked vertically, venting into a deep pit that could be accessed from the outside for cleaning. Some historians believe this design was the medieval precursor to the modern outhouse. It allowed better ventilation, isolated the smell, and kept all the business away from bedrooms and kitchens. Castles like Château de Coucy in France boasted entire towers dedicated to toileting, and during winter, these could be partially insulated with straw or cloth draped across the interior to block the worst drafts. Was it perfect? Absolutely not. But it was a solid step towards sanitary compartmentalization, a big deal when your only other option was the same chamber pot as your cousin's pet ferret. And let's not forget wiping technology. We've touched on this before, but it's worth noting that during the colder months, people got creative. Old manuscripts, dried leaves, hay, and even cloth rags were reused with careful folding and, let's be honest, varying levels of success. But some castles had designated wipe cloths that were boiled regularly, a nod toward hygiene that seems ahead of its time. There are even records of wiping sticks, yes, sticks, wrapped in wool or moss and placed near garderobes for reuse. Not exactly charmine, but resourceful. Debate among historians continues today about how much of this was widespread versus elite only. Some argue that these innovations were rare luxuries, limited to grand castles with massive estates. Others point to architectural remnants and castle ruins across Europe that suggest many of these features, vented garderobes, sluiced pits, rotating chutes, were more common than previously thought, especially by the 14th and 15th centuries. Either way, one thing is clear. People were trying. They weren't sitting around in filth by choice. They were freezing, yes, disgusted often, but they were also adapting. And isn't that what humans do best? Even in the dead of winter, with a broken chamber pot and a howling wind outside, somebody somewhere was saying there's got to be a better way, then sketching a chute or heating a stone or bribing a monk to invent something. So if you think medieval life was all frozen misery and dung disasters, well yes, but it was also ingenuity born from discomfort, a kind of quiet, determined engineering, where the stakes were not just dignity, but basic survival. We've come a long way, trudged through frozen moats of misery, creaked open icy garderobe doors, and felt the collective embarrassment of 1,000 drafty misfires. But let's take a breath here and shift focus from the mechanics and misery of medieval toilets to something even more bizarre, what people believed about their bodily functions. Because in the Middle Ages, your waste wasn't just waste, it was a window into your soul, your health, your character, and possibly your eternal destiny. Tonight, we plunge into the swirling cesspool of medieval toilet beliefs, folk medicine, and gut-based diagnostics. Spoiler, you're not leaving this part without thinking twice the next time you sneeze near a chamber pot. Let's begin with the cornerstone of medieval health theory, the four humours. If you're not familiar, this was the dominant medical philosophy from ancient Greece through most of the Middle Ages. It said your body was governed by four main fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Health came from keeping these in balance. Illness? That meant one or more was out of whack. And how, you ask? Did medieval doctors determine which humour was causing trouble? Simple, they looked at your poop. Yup. Medieval physicians, and often anyone who'd read a medical pamphlet or overheard a monk muttering, believed that the colour, texture, smell and behaviour of your bowel movements were key indicators of internal balance. Runny and yellow, too much choler; thick and black, probably melancholic; pale and dry, you needed more blood or maybe a mild bleeding. No joke, your daily deposit could be read like a medieval horoscope. And just like horoscopes, there was a lot of room for interpretation. People kept an eye on each other's toilet behaviour the way we monitor Wi-Fi signals today. A nobleman who visited the garderobe too often might be accused of harbouring fiery bile. A servant who didn't go for 2 days was told to eat pickled onions and say a psalm, and children? Their poop was watched with the anxious reverence of weather patterns. A healthy child who had firm but not dry output. Too loose? Bad milk. Too dry? A sign of sin? Seriously. But it gets weirder. Some medieval texts claim that bowel habits revealed moral character. A man who relieved himself with quiet dignity was thought to be virtuous. One who farted loudly or made too much of a fuss in the garderobe, vain, perhaps even deceitful. In some religious communities, bodily control was equated with spiritual control. A monk who defecated too frequently or too vigorously might be accused of gluttony, a cardinal sin. Yes, sin by way of stool. And yet, despite all this policing of the posterior, medieval folk also believed in the healing power of excrement. Let's take a moment. Manure was already a known agricultural asset, but some folk healers genuinely believed human waste had medicinal properties. For certain skin conditions, applying warm dung, human or animal, was thought to draw out toxins. There are surviving recipes for salves made with dried feces, honey and herbs, rubbed on boils or infected wounds. One charming entry from a 13th century herbal suggests a child's fresh stool mixed with vinegar to treat warts. So if you ever thought medieval life couldn't get grosser, well, here we are. There was also a thriving business in analysing excrement. Doctors, or leeches, as they were often called, would demand to inspect your evacuation before making a diagnosis. Patients brought their waste in cloth-wrapped bundles or ceramic pots, still steaming in the winter air, hoping to receive guidance. Imagine the horror of walking through a snow-covered courtyard, balancing a pot of your own poop, just to be told you had too much yellow bile and needed more wine. Medieval medicine, where bedside manner met chamber pot. Of course, not all analysis was scientific. There were also omens and superstitions. One widespread belief said that if your waist froze instantly in winter, it was a sign of divine judgment, that your body was unnatural or out of sync with the seasons. Another warned that seeing your own reflection in the surface of a chamber pot, yes, that happened with glaze pottery, could invite demons. This led to some people covering their pots with cloth before and after use, not for modesty, but to avoid staring into the abyss. And what about dreams? Oh yes, there were interpretations for that too. Dreaming of defecating in public. You were harbouring a guilty secret. Dreaming of relieving yourself into a clear stream. Good luck and financial prosperity were on the way. Dreaming that your chamber pot broke. Bad omen. Illness. Trail or a failing crop. Even saints and religious figures weren't immune to the subject. Some hagiographies describe holy men whose bowel movements were odourless and minimal, proof of their spiritual purity. Others mention ascetic monks who deliberately held their waist in for days as a form of penance. One even reportedly used a frozen chamber pot as a seat during prayer. To feel the suffering of Christ through cold and discomfort, that's commitment. And then there's the absolutely real, absolutely strange phenomenon of blessed dung. In one remote monastery, a revered abbot's waist was supposedly preserved for a year in a ceramic vessel, then buried beneath the foundation of a new garden for good fortune. When the plants grew unusually large, pilgrims came to sit nearby and pray. A few even took samples of the soil. The abbot's holy humours were said to encourage fertility in both land and livestock. Is it true? Hard to say, but the story has been recorded more than once. Someone believed it. Let's not forget the toilet-related penances either. Confession wasn't just for what you said or did, it was also for what you excreted. Eating too much in winter when food was scarce could lead to overindulgence in the garderobe. Some priests assigned extra prayers if you were known to be a gluttonous wiper. Others warned that spending unnecessary time in the latrine was a sign of sloth. So yes, even your bathroom breaks could affect your salvation scorecard. To us, all of this seems absurd, but to medieval people, the body was a mystery. A sacred, flawed, and very smelly vessel trying to make it through a harsh, frozen world. The ways it functioned or didn't were meaningful. If your stool turned green, you prayed. If it froze instantly, you repented. If it moved smoothly and quietly, you thanked God. And through it all, beneath the theology, the superstition, the gag-inducing folk remedies, was a very human truth. People were scared. Of illness, of death, of judgment. The toilet wasn't just a place of relief. It was a moment of vulnerability, of reflection, of mystery. So next time you sit on your climate-controlled throne with your scented candle burning and your phone glowing, take a moment. Remember the monk balancing on a frozen pot, the peasant mumbling a blessing over their chamber bucket, the lady wrapping her linen with trembling fingers, hoping this time her body would be kind. Because in the medieval mind, every drop, every movement, every scent meant something. And no one, no matter how noble or poor, escaped the sacred strangeness of it all. So here we are, near the end of our frozen journey through pipes that weren't really pipes, chamber pots that doubled as spiritual omens, and toilets that could collapse under the sheer weight of winter despair. But before we dim the torchlight and pad softly back into the warm dreamlands, there's one last piece of this chilly, poop-covered puzzle we need to explore. What happened when it all failed? Because sometimes, despite every smart stone groove, every servant with a warming brick, and every hopeful chant uttered over a steaming pot, the medieval toilet system just broke. And when it did, chaos followed. Let's talk disasters. First up, the Great Overflow. There are multiple accounts across castle records, especially during harsh winters, of cesspits flooding. You might be picturing a bubbling fountain. No, think more like a silent, creeping ooze, a frozen shaft that suddenly thaws after weeks of sub-zero temperatures. All that pressure, all that compacted filth, finds the path of least resistance, and usually that means back through the garderobe chute. There's one story of a manor in Yorkshire where the Lord's garderobe exploded mid-feast. A sickening geyser of black, steaming filth burst into the hall, splattering walls, upending tables, and clearing the room faster than a Mongol raid. Historians still argue whether it was caused by blockage, freezing, or just architectural arrogance. Then there were the chamber pot collapses. Ceramic was fragile, especially when fired poorly or reused too many times. In freezing conditions, cracks widened, and pots burst without warning. A lady's maid in Burgundy reportedly dropped a chamber pot during a midwinter chamber cleaning, only to have it explode on the stone floor, coating her, the bed curtains, and most of the polished rush matting in something that required immediate confession. Her account is still preserved in a letter, complete with phrases like unspeakable doom and the linens were beyond redemption. But the most dangerous failures weren't always explosive. Sometimes they were structural. Toilet towers, as impressive as they were, relied heavily on stable walls, tight masonry, and functioning waste shafts. But stone doesn't handle moisture well, especially when waste seeps into cracks and freezes. Over time, this causes expansion, pressure, and, inevitably, collapse. There's a case in a 15th century German castle where part of a garderobe tower simply sheared off the wall and fell into the moat, carrying 3 terrified knights and 1 unlucky servant with it. Only the servant survived. His recollection was that the stink rose like a demon, and we prayed as we fell. Let's not forget the ever-lurking threat of fire. Yes, fire. Because as insane as it sounds, medieval people often brought torches or candles into garderobes to light the way, especially during long winter nights. Combine that with a methane-rich shaft filled with slowly fermenting waste and you have a recipe for disaster. One scribe in a Scottish keep recorded a flash of devil's breath that roared up through the chute when a servant dropped a lantern. The resulting fire singed the upper floors and gave rise to rumours that the castle was haunted. It wasn't haunted, it was just flammable poop gas. And while we're talking about injury, we need to mention slips and falls. Garderobe floors were cold, damp, and often slick with condensation or, let's be honest, missed attempts. In the dark of early morning, half asleep and bundled in 10 pounds of wool, people stumbled. People slipped. And some fell in. There's no delicate way to say this. At least 3 chronicles describe individuals, usually servants or children, falling through open waste shafts into the pits below. Rescue attempts varied. Success rates were low. If the cold didn't get you, the trauma would. Of course, not every failure was physical. Sometimes it was political. A blocked or overflowing toilet could become a symbol of neglect, poor management, or divine disfavour. Lords who failed to maintain their garderobes earned reputations for filth. One noblewoman refused to marry a suitor because his estate had a stink that clung to his garments like sin. That's rough. In one French estate, the steward was dismissed after repeated complaints that the guest garderobe froze shut every January. His replacement dug the chute deeper, lined it with lime, and added a woven screen for warmth. Morale soared. Marriages resumed. Even monks, those champions of order and humility, weren't immune. Monastic records from Canterbury show entire community meetings held to address latrine grievances. Complaints ranged from frozen buckets to insufficient moss to frightful echoes, disturbing prayer. One monk noted, "If the Lord's house be clean, so must the place of evacuation. So saith the Lord, apparently." And then there were the social disasters, the whispered gossip, the red-faced apologies, the lifelong nicknames. Imagine being known as Sir Slipsalot because you took a tumble on a frosty garderobe step. Or Lady Leaks for reasons no one says out loud anymore. In tight castle communities, these accidents became stories. Stories became legends, and legends were recited long after your descendants took the throne. Toilet shame, like chamber pots, had long shelf lives. So how did people deal with this looming risk of failure? Some added redundancy, extra chamber pots stored near the hearth in case the main one cracked. Others used poultices made of wax and wool to seal cracks in stone seats. There are even descriptions of servants applying hot fat to wooden toilet lids so they wouldn't freeze shut. Over-prepared nobles carried warming bricks and footstools to avoid accidents. Still, none of these could prevent what winter did best: ruin good intentions. And beneath it all was the unspoken understanding. The toilet system, such as it was, worked just enough, until it didn't. Then you had to act fast, scrub hard, and pray no one wrote a song about it. Because ultimately, medieval toilets weren't built for perfection, they were built to function, through snow, storm, and siege. When they failed, it was messy, sometimes tragic, occasionally hilarious. But every failure reminded people just how fragile civilization really was. One broken pot, one cracked shower, one frozen chute, and suddenly your glorious stone fortress turned into a cautionary tale. So if you've stuck with me through collapsing towers, frozen turrets, and geysers of doom, take a moment and be thankful. Your worst toilet disaster probably didn't involve a monk, a torch, and a 3-story drop. And if it did, well, at least you've got plumbing now. So here we are. You made it. You survived the freezing garderobes, the slippery stone benches, the geysers of doom, the chamber pots that shattered dreams and backs, and the silent glances passed between noblemen shoulder to shoulder in communal latrines. And while your pride may be intact, let's be honest, your sense of mystery surrounding castle life probably isn't. Because after everything we've seen tonight, one thing is crystal clear. Medieval castle life wasn't all jousting tournaments, courtly love, and crackling hearth fires. Sometimes it was just you, a freezing draft, and the grim hope that the hole beneath you wouldn't collapse. But let's give credit where credit is due. These people lived through some of the coldest winters Europe had to offer, with none of the comforts we take for granted today. They wrapped themselves in wool and linen, waddled down echoing stone hallways to relieve themselves in what can only be described as glorified stone closets, and still found the time to build cathedrals, write epic poems, and invade neighbouring territories. That's commitment. That's grit. And yeah, maybe a little bit of desperation. What stands out most, though, isn't the discomfort. It's the humanity. The quiet moments. The monk warming a chamber pot near the fire before sunrise. The lady in waiting holding a curtain so her mistress could squat in peace. The kid who slipped on frozen slop and became a legend. These weren't just characters from a dusty history book, they were people. Real, living, breathing, shivering people doing their best to maintain dignity in the most undignified of circumstances. And despite all the filth, the cold, the smell, you can't help but admire the weird brilliance of it all. The stone chutes angled for maximum splash avoidance, the velvet-lined close stools, the holy poop gardens, the way even your bodily functions could be read like divine omens. If anything, medieval toilets weren't just functional, they were symbolic. Of class, of power, of belief, of survival. So now, as you lie there in the soft glow of your screen, your heating system humming gently in the background, maybe a cup of tea within reach, take a moment. Appreciate the miracle of warm porcelain, of scented soaps, of toilet paper. Appreciate your distance from the chamber pots of yesteryear, and the sheer number of servants it used to take to keep a single butt from freezing to stone. And hey, if you enjoyed this little nighttime detour into the frigid, fragrant world of medieval sanitation, make sure to like the video and subscribe. Seriously, it helps keep the stories flowing, just maybe not the same kind of flowing we've been talking about tonight. Now go ahead, dim those lights, let the fan hum, breathe easy, knowing that your toilet probably won't explode during the night. Probably sleep well and dream of Hebler castles, preferably with plumbing.